Hello, everybody. I think this should be working. So, just waiting to see if people can say hi in the comments. Apologies if you're watching this in the recorded version, but I do always like to make sure that people can hear me before starting. Okay, so that's good. Right, everyone can hear me. Excelente. Right, so this is a follow-up to the previous stream that we did. So this is last stream we were doing July's questions, which I missed. And then we're also doing now August's. We're doing August Patreon questions, followed by stuff from chat. And that means technically we're up to schedule, although technically also this should be September's. So, but if we're a week out with September's, that's not as bad as 2 months out with July. Oh, that's good to hear. New ferrets. New ferrets are always a good thing. So as before, we'll go through the Patreon questions. I say these are from Drydock 213, the end of August, and then there are 30 of those. Once we've gone through those, we'll take questions from chat. And just so you're aware, there will be a couple of doorbell chimes going off during this time because there's some food orders coming in because we've got back. That's probably one of them. Yeah. That's one of them updating. We basically come back from Tiger Day at the Tank Museum in Bovington. So there's some coordinated recording I did with the Star Trek channel Venom Geek Media that I've been working with before. So that won't obviously be on this channel, but it'll be there. So if you want to watch two Star Trek geeks talking about Star Trek on Weymouth Beach and in a car, then that's a thing. Anyway, let's get on with it, shall we? So Chazix asks, what if HMS Royal Oak had survived the attack by U-47? So, well, I'd have one more family member. But if that had happened, Royal Oak was basically the most modernised of the R-class. That's not saying a lot compared to Warspite, Valiant and Queen Elizabeth, but she was significantly more capable than, Resolution, Royal Oak, Revenge and Ramillies. If she'd survived, she wouldn't have been with the home fleet too much longer, I don't think, because, even modernised, she's relatively slow. I think she probably would have become a linchpin of the Mediterranean fleet, because the others can do convoy escort just as well, but when you look at how some of the R-class that survived coped with life in the Mediterranean, which is to say not particularly well, due to their reduced speed and capabilities, Royal Oak would have been a slightly better fit for that. So I think she probably would have spent the majority of her time in the Med. Almost certainly would have joined the rest of her sister ships in the Eastern Fleet briefly in 1942, and then it would have been back to the Med, and then as more and better ships came online, either shore bombardment or convoy escort, she probably would have seen out the war. The only thing that I would say might have ended badly for her, because obviously there's potential of random U-boat attack or whatever, but being that she would be in the best condition, she might have been the one that got lent to the Russians instead of Royal Sovereign, which would be, that would not be a very fun way to end her career. Jeff C, HMCS Hyder video probably coming towards the end of the year. I'm a little bit undecided on when to put that up, because I have I'm doing one video a month from the US Museum Ship Tour, but with Hyder particularly, if I put a video up now, I'm not sure that'll drive the visitor numbers quite as much as perhaps in spring, so I'm back and forth on that one. Oh yeah, and in reference to Tiger Day, since multiple people, including myself, did ask them nicely, and they refused, in some cases being very rude about it, a curse on those idiots who decided to go to Tiger Day, presumably have probably been to Tank Fest as well, and decided, there's an area where we can stand up at the front, and there's an area where we can stand up at the back, and then there's this hill in the middle where everybody else sits, the children who are small, and if they can't, and, can't see over someone who stands up regardless. The older people who also probably aren't in a shape to stand up. And this benighted group of about 50, 60 morons just decide to stand up on the hill, thus blocking the view, not only of everybody behind them, which was about a quarter of the hill, but also blocking the shot of people like myself who had decent cameras and wanted to take shots of the tanks, but were staying seated so that everyone behind us could see. And then when you look left on, if any of you have been to Tank Fest, and you're looking at it from where the museum is, there's this lovely sweep, which is a left-hand turn for the tanks, that gives you absolutely excellent shots of the tanks coming down. And every time I try to take a shot down there, what do I get? The back of people's heads. So when I do a video on that and how each tank can be related to naval warfare, expect a lot of upbraiding of very specific people, which I have 4K high-resolution shots of the back of their heads for. But simultaneously, shout out to the absolute legend who was sitting nearby us, who joined in the initial shouts to try and get people to sit down, but when that proved unsuccessful, he only had his phone camera, and he could have stood up with everybody else and blocked everybody else's view, but instead he stood up when he wanted to get a photo of the tanks and scuttled down in a kind of half crouch so he wasn't obscuring people's view, went down to the front, right down at the bottom where you were supposed to stand, took his photos, and came back again. So yeah, middle-aged guy with dreadlocks and a family, absolute legend. Sorry I didn't get your name. Anyway, now that that's off my chest. Mason asks, what if a British battleship like an old R-class had been present during the Dieppe raid? Does it go much better? Well, I mean, having 8 15-inch guns and a bunch of 6-inch secondaries able to level some of the immediate surroundings can't hurt, but overall I can't see it going that much better, because 15-inch shells aren't going to change the nature of the beach, even if it might, let's say, blow a few holes in seawalls and so forth, and it'll help suppress German troops. But the problem is, if you're attacking Dieppe, sooner or later you're going to be under the attack by the Luftwaffe, and if there's a socking great battleship blowing things up, then very soon that's going to prompt the attack of Luftwaffe bombers a lot sooner. So I have a feeling that it might have made the raid go slightly better at first, but overall probably would have ended up worse, because it would have prompted a much stronger response from the Germans. And potentially, I mean, even if you have a best case early few hours scenario where the Germans are driven back and the raiders go in and they do whatever they want to do and then they're able to withdraw, you could have a worst case scenario where actually the raid itself appears to have gone spectacularly well, and then the attack force is harried and sunk in large part by the Luftwaffe on its way home. So yeah, that wouldn't have been fun. Kainoa Danfords asks, I saw a diagram showing that one of Yamato's main battery turrets weighed around the same as a Fletcher. So if you pulled the turrets off and welded a fully loaded, well-crewed Fletcher over each one of the holes, would Yamato survive long enough to beach herself? I mean, the logistics of that are highly amusing to me, because, of course, yes, each one of Yamato's main battery turrets was heavier than a Fletcher, but in part that was because, the turrets were made of a couple of feet thick armour plate, if you were looking at them from the front, and the rest of it wasn't exactly that much lighter. A Fletcher, which doesn't have massive thick armour plate, is considerably larger volume than a turret. So if you have taken the turrets off, I guess you'd have to spot weld them perpendicular, so it would look like, you know, Yamato would have these 2 Fletchers at the front and 1 Fletcher aft, just sort of sticking, 4 bow and stern sticking out each side. You could make that work, I guess. I'd love to see the stability calculations for that. Now, you know, putting the hilarity of what it would look like aside, if you had 3 fully loaded, well-trained Fletchers, and they were, you know, for hand-wavy magic reasons, trying to keep Yamato alive instead of just opening up at point blank on her, then would Yamato last long enough to beach herself? Well, you've got 15 5-inch guns, multiple sets of fire control directors, and a smattering of 40mm and 20mm. She'd certainly do a lot better. Whether she'd survive long enough to beach herself, I don't know. Well, Yamato kind of came through the first... The problem is that Yamato came through the first attack wave relatively intact, but that was largely because that attack wave spent a lot of its efforts in just stripping away all her escorts. So you've basically got 3 unsinkable Fletchers as additional escorts with much better AA. But, I mean, she'll do better. She might need another wave to finish her off, but, you know, even 3 Fletchers against hundreds upon hundreds of aircraft, it's not gonna stop the attack. It's not gonna, you know, you might, especially with the Avengers coming excuse me, especially with the Avengers coming down, 5-inch guns firing proximity fuse shells straight into their faces might stop a bunch of the torpedoes and everything, but eventually you throw hundreds of aircraft at a ship, it's going to take its toll. So yeah, I doubt she'd survive long enough to beach herself, although she might survive into the next day. Rodney McCoy asks, if you replace the American cruisers and destroyers at the first night battle of Guadalcanal with an equivalent British force of similar cruisers and destroyers, how would British commanders have tried to fight the battle, and what tactics would they have employed? Okay, so if... just thinking of the destroyers. Okay, so you've got a mixture of... If you're looking at time contemporaneous destroyers, you're probably looking at a mixture of the late interwar classic British destroyers and some of the bigger ones. The bigger ones being statistically more likely to... Thank you. Sorry, that's the food being passed to me. Being statistically more likely to have radar than the smaller ones. Cruisers, well, I mean, there's a bunch of heavy cruisers there, so the counties are the only real stand-ins for them. And yeah, anything else is just, yeah, pick a random light cruiser, probably not going to matter that much. In mid-1942, statistically, there's a higher chance of multiple cruisers having radar. Now, on the other hand, the deployment was done by Admiral Crutchley, who had previously been Captain Crutchley, who had previously taken Warspite into Narvik, although obviously with influence from the US captains that he was there with as well. So I can't. I mean, the thing is, the Royal Navy obviously didn't face this kind of, you know, having to hold a position with a cruiser squadron that was relatively static against possible incoming enemy support. So I don't think I could safely say that they would have tried significantly more different tactics, but with the probably larger number of radars in the mix, it's more likely that the Japanese would have been seen coming in the first place, and you know, whatever happens at that point, the British do have better night fighting doctrine than the Americans do at that point, and as Canberra proved, a better ability to get to action stations. So if I was going to go with a median scenario, I would roughly put the various units' positions in roughly the same locations, but with maybe a 3 or 4 more minutes warning from somebody's radar spotting the Japanese coming, as Canberra showed, that would probably give everyone just enough time to get to action stations, at which point the Japanese... You can see what British tactics were like when they had a fix on radar with things like North Cape. You let the enemy get as close as possible, and then when they look like they're about to twitch, that's when you open fire. So I think there probably would have been a near simultaneous opening of fire at very close range. Obviously, at that point, British torpedoes would be able to reach out to the Japanese because they launched well within the range of the long lances, and I think it would have been a lot more brutal for the Japanese. It would have also been very brutal especially for the first section of cruisers, because it's a close-range firefight between two forces very well trained in night fighting at a point where, there's lots of torpedoes in the water. The armour's probably not going to help anyone on either side, but it would be a very much diminished Japanese force that would then wind up going into at that point, it would have to be alerted second force. So I think overall it might have ended with a Japanese defeat, but that's kind of a median scenario. It would still be entirely possible for a similar thing to happen as happened with the historical American force, with, the Japanese force happening to slip between a couple of destroyers. Sorry. I'm very hungry. I'm going to try not to eat too much in the stream, but my stomach was very, very rumbly. The Aristocats asks, in late October, Data and Dace are joined by 4 additional sisters. What is the damage an ambush of 6 Gato or Gato class subs can do to the centre force if their aim is anywhere near as good? It can't just be additive, as new strategies should allow for more kills. How many sisters would be needed for the combined weight of numbers and the follow-up air attack for Samar not to happen? So if we give the other 4 arrivals as good aim as Data and Dace, then if you want to maximize their chances, then probably what you want to do is have almost adapting things from a German Wolfpack strategy. So have Data and Dace in their historical locations, and then what I would do is I would put 3 more subs spaced out heading towards the strait in good attack positions, and then I would have 1 sub slightly further back, so slightly further along from Data and Dace, but slightly further back, so out of easy visual spotting range in the night time. And then I think at that point what I'd do is the sort of the backstop is going to act a bit like the coordination U-boat in a Wolfpack. So it would see Data and Dace's attacks go in, and it would then be able to, it probably itself can't do much attacking, but then it can go, right, this is the enemy force composition, this is what's been hit, this is the direction they're going at this time, at this range, basically absolutely lock in the positions of the Japanese forces and transmit that to the 3 remaining subs further down the line. And so the Japanese would be thinking, okay, right, well, we've had some kind of submarine attack, but we've got through, and surely that the worst of it is over. And then they get hit again and again and again, and this being, the late war, their torpedoes are actually working, and then you're going to end up with them being very, very chewed up close to the strait, probably with multiple losses. 3 Gatos or Gatos, even with maximum opportunity, you're going to sink a few more, maybe damage some of the capital ships if you get a good spread in, or maybe even sink a Kondo or something. Would that stop Samar from happening? I think it depends on what gets hit. I think if somebody gets very lucky and puts 4 to 6 torpedoes into Yamato, that might make Kurita stop and turn around. But if because then this is where you get the luck of the draw. If you knock off cruisers, destroyers, maybe put a torpedo into a Kondo or two, then Kurita probably still will just try and force things through. But if you hit and sink or cripple Nagato and or Yamato, then Kurita might at that point, turn around and go, yeah, we're done. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, fans of boxing and martial arts use a pound-for-pound ranking to debate the best fighters of all time or in a particular era for many weight classes. Could a similar system be applied for ships? And if so, what would you rate as the top 5 ships pound for pound or ton for ton of the Second World War? In some ways, yes, but in other ways, no. So I don't think you could just do a ton for ton ranking of all ships across World War II, because different ships have very different balances. So if you were doing a ton for ton ranking, destroyers would come out looking exceptionally overpowered because they have basically put 0 tonnage into protection, and they're partly as a result of that. Especially if you take something like a gearing or a tribal that has 6 or 8 guns on a 2,000-ish and a bit ton hull, that's going to look incredible in terms of barrels or broadside weight per ton, is going to look very, very overpowered compared to something like a battleship that's had to invest in a foot plus of armor plate. But if you split it down on a type by type basis, then yes, I think you probably could rate battleships, for example, on a ton for ton basis, and you can analyze it in multiple ways. You can analyze it in terms of firepower per ton, armor weight per ton, speed per ton, and then try and factor those in those multiple types, anti-aircraft firepower per ton for that matter, and then factor all those into an overall score. The problem is if you do it for one, then you have to do it for everything. Now, I kind of did a spreadsheet very similar to that for the carrier analysis that I did a while back between the American and British carriers in World War II. So I guess I could extrapolate that at least and include the Japanese carriers, and then maybe see if I can work out what to change for a battleship analysis, because of course the carrier analysis doesn't it goes for anti-aircraft firepower per ton and so forth, but it doesn't go for main gun firepower per ton, because apart from the Lexingtons they don't really have any, and equally aircraft per ton is going to be a silly value for battleships. So I think it would be possible to do on a type by type basis, but I don't have any exact answers for you at the moment, other than I can near enough guarantee Bismarck is coming near the bottom of the ton for ton efficiency ratio. Okay, David B. Asks, if it's 1915 and the US Navy has successfully pulled off its last 2 great repairs, quote unquote, on old warships. So this is the US Navy's wonderful ability of saying, yes, we're repairing an old ship and actually building a new one with 4 bolts taken from the old one included. They actually developed 2 battle cruisers. What if the US Navy had taken a page from the Royal Navy playbook, taken in New Mexico, dropped the rear super-firing turret to gain a 27 to 28 knot speed, presumably lengthen the hull slightly as well, and kept the displacement to roughly the 34,000 tons? How effective would they have been in World War One? Also, assuming that the battle cruisers had a meeting engagement. Okay. Okay, so basically, how effective would they have been in World War One? This is assuming that they get sent over to 6th Battle Squadron, and how well would they have done in World War Two? It's a good question. Now, the problem with them being present in World War One is that the US Navy very deliberately sent partly at the Royal Navy's request, their coal-firing ships to the 6th Battle Squadron, because although a lot of their more recent stuff was oil-fired, the Royal Navy had coal in massive amounts and didn't have oil in quite so many amounts. So if they've gone with the New Mexico battleship to battlecruiser conversion, it's 99.999% chance it's not going to be sent because of they're going to drink a lot of oil fuel. However, given that the presence of 2 such ships would massively increase the fighting power of the battlecruiser fleet, there is a chance that someone like Beatty might actually request them. Now, if there was as he says in the question, assume the battlecruisers have a meeting engagement while covering the Norway convoys. Well, having a pair of battlecruisers capable of 28 knots with 9 14-inch guns is going to help hugely with that. I think the main thing is going to be how much armor have they got. Because if they've dropped their armor from 13 and a bit inches down to 11 or 12 inches, so German style, then they're going to be absolutely monstrous vessels. If they've dropped them down to Kondo or Lion Tiger, sort of 9-inch armor, they're still going to be very powerful, but possibly vulnerable at closer ranges. Albeit that the Germans are still going with just 12-inch guns for their battle cruisers, so they'd probably still be okay. And they don't have Royal Navy cordites, so even if they do get hit, there's a relatively low chance of them exploding. So they still would have done very well. And the battle cruiser fleets already had a numerical superiority over first scouting group. This is just going to make the situation a lot worse. If somehow they've broadly kept their armor, and I don't know quite how they do that. I have to run the design through Spring Shop, but if they've somehow kept their armor to something close to battleship levels, got up to 27, 28 knots, and just had to pay a turret for it, then they're going to be absolutely heavy hitters. So yeah, effectiveness in World War I of that kind of design would be very effective. In World War II, that's going to be a more interesting thing. It would come down, I think, to are they at Pearl Harbor and how do they fare there? But secondly, how have they been treated during the interwar period? Because 27, 28 knots, if they've broadly kept that speed up, then, well, effectively you're looking at kind of a proto version of what the US was planning to build with the North Carolinas anyway, just with slightly fewer 14-inch guns. So they may, assuming that they aren't sunk or heavily damaged at Pearl Harbor, they'd probably go out with the carrier escorts. But if there was one vessel, if these existed, they would be the one vessel that maybe the US Navy might be tempted to modernize, kind of like the Royal Navy and the Italians did in the 1930s, because without spending absolute fortunes Italian style, you were never going to get a standard up to 27, 28 knots. But if you've already got 27, 28 knots, and assuming maybe these ships are using turbo-electric drive, which is quite bulky, then if you, say, put them into modernization in 1935, ripped out the turbo-electric drives, put in brand new high-pressure power plants with geared turbines, you could probably, I would say, probably easily push them up to about 30 knots without too much effort, and probably still save space and displacement in order to convert them to have 5-inch 38 anti-aircraft batteries. Because from a American perspective, they'd make perfect Congo hunters, predating the Iowas. If you can get them just north of 30 knots, they've got an extra gun compared to the Congos. They've probably got better armor than the Congos, and they can now match the Congos with speed. And if you stick some 5-inch 38s, you now have the perfect battleship escort. So they probably, again, assuming that they survive Pearl Harbor, would spend much of the early war charging around doing what Washington and South Dakota did in mid to late 1942, escorting the carriers, which may or may not save Lexington, and may or may not save Yorktown. We can't tell, obviously, exactly, but the US might not be down 2 carriers but after Coral Sea and Midway. Hand of Ray asks, what is your favourite paper or just plain made up ship from World of Warships? My favourite paper ship from World of Warships is the Minotaur, but that's because I really like playing it. My favourite paper ship, other paper ships... the Georgia. I really like playing the Georgia. I think I have a weakness when it comes to World of Warships, at least if I'm playing capital ships, for very high speed capital ships that people really don't expect. So Georgia, Repulse, Incomparable, I really like playing those because you can just, especially if you've got the engine boost, you can just hit the engine boost, and if you've rigged the captain skills for engine boost as well, you just go sailing along at absolutely monstrous speeds, and you literally will have people who will fire at you, and the first 2 or 3 salvos will fall behind you because they're adjusting their fire for what they expect to be firing at, which is, at least with Georgia and Incomparable, they expect to be firing at something doing 32, 33, 34 knots. They're not expecting you to be doing 41, 40 to 43 knots. And that would be... And it's just a fun experience to have. One of the funniest things I ever did in my Incomparable was to just chase down a French destroyer. And he could do nothing. Because I was bow on. If he turned broadside, he knew he was going to eat 4 20-inch HE shells to the face. So he apparently decided he didn't want to launch torpedoes, but one of the biggest assets of the French destroyers in that game is speed, and sorry, you can't outrun me. So I can't remember. I know I went to ram him. I just can't remember if I actually managed to ram him or if I ended up finishing him off with an HE shell. But there you go. SWE 420 Den. In an alternate history where Germany is a signatory of the Washington Naval Treaty instead of the UK, i.e. somehow the UK is no longer a naval power, what changes do you think would occur in the naval treaty system, and what ships would the Imperial German Navy try to keep, what ships would be modernised, and how effective would they be? Okay, assuming this is somehow happening, that means the Germans have probably completed the Mackensons, Sachsen and Württemberg, so they're going to keep those plus Bayern and Baden. However, a Washington Naval Treaty where Germany is the signatory, because they've somehow managed to beat the UK at being a naval power, Germany is probably going to find itself roughly on a par with Japan, because the US, in any semi-sane scenario, the German fleet would have taken a fairly heavy pasting, presumably destroying the Grand Fleet. And between that and US industrial power, there's no way the US is going to accept an even ship number with Germany. They might acknowledge Germany as the second navy, but they are not going to say, no, we'll give you 553. The Washington Naval Treaty is probably going to be 533, i.e. Germany and Japan get 3/5 of whatever the US dictates it gets. And if we assume that the US pretty much dictates that roughly the same kind of displacement limits as they did at Washington historically, then you probably got the 4 loosely associated Bayerns or Bardens as a battleship line, 4 Mackensons. Then they'd probably initially keep the Der Flinger and Hindenburg, and maybe, whichever of the Kaisers and Königs survived the presumably apocalyptic battle. But the Kaisers and Königs would be dropped first, probably in exchange for Germany, the survivors, not both classes, but whichever one of the survivors they keep, those will probably be dropped in exchange for at least 1, possibly 2 16-inch battleships, probably the L-20E Alphas. They'd be under construction, but not completed yet, so it'll be a case of, okay, you get rid of those 3 or 4 ships when the L-20E Alphas come in, so that gives them a 6 battleship, 4 battle cruiser fleet, pretty much actually identical to the Japanese, plus Der Flinger and Hindenburg, which will probably end up being dropped in the late 30s, kind of like Tiger was out of the Royal Navy. Now, what would be modernised? Well, for the Germans, if I was the Germans, I would probably be planning to replace the various Bayern derivatives, modernise the L-20E Alphas, modernise the Mackensons, and prepare my 1930s battleship class as replacements one for one for the Bardens and Bayerns, and then obviously things would kick off as the tree system collapsed. I think that's about it. Okaj has a very large question, so as with the other large question we had last time, I'm going to keep that one for last. Jean Perilla, I think, maybe, asks, how would the convoy system be affected if Bismarck had survived and the Germans had most of their heavy surface units in France intact and operational? So basically, if you have Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Bismarck and Prince Eugen all sitting in Brest. For example, would the British assemble massive mega convoys protected by several battleships, or would the convoy system be abolished for the same reasons as to why PQ-17 was scattered? Ooh. I think... Well, I mean, the RAF raids against Brest would be stepped up massively. I'm trying to think, if you've got 3 battleships, albeit 2 of them light plus a heavy cruiser, the British would probably want 4 battleships on readiness at any one time. Ideally more. So Prince of Wales definitely isn't going to the east. The problem the British will have got is that without Hood, they only have Prince of Wales and King George V that have the speed and the armour to go toe-to-toe with. Now, in theory, I suppose you can pull Renown and Repulse in, because, well, Renown proved that she can take on the Scharnhorst at Lofoten, so you maybe could make an argument that Renown and Repulse would be pulled in to match against Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Prince of Wales and King George V would be pulled in to be the kind of the matches to Bismarck and Tirpitz, but that would be a very tenuous force balance, because theoretically you're matching 1v1, which means anything that goes wrong, either in battle or in terms of, having to go in for a refit, immediately gives the Germans superiority. Rodney and Nelson would be great assets, but if the Germans have that force, it's going to be a fast force. You don't want to keep that concentration of battleships out at sea waiting for the Germans to come out, because, well, A, it's an invitation for U-boat or air attack, and B, they can only be out there for a limited amount of time. I have a feeling what they would probably do is probably try and put some kind of subcordon off of Brest, as I increase the number of air attacks on Brest, form up as best they could some kind of fast response squadron, maybe even move them further west to Lough Swilly to give them a better shot at heading out into the Atlantic instead of having to go from Scapa. and reroute the convoys much further north to give them plenty of interception time. Now, that's probably the best they can. They can't really afford to shut the convoy system down for months. Britain needs those materials. So yeah, it will probably be large convoys routed very far north with a very, very nervous Royal Navy waiting to see what the Germans would do. Albeit, of course, if Tirpitz is stuck in Germany, then, and Bismarck, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau are stuck in Brest, then theoretically the Royal Navy squadron would have overall superiority. But they'd be looking in two directions at once. So yeah, it would be an interesting scenario to try and work out. Amanda Jones asks, as Admiral Nelson turns his signals officer into order hoisting of England expects, he finds himself teleported to the bridge of a well-crewed Royal Navy warship from the future, which has replaced the entire British fleet. What is the earliest ship he could sail into Trafalgar and still win? Basically, this comes down to first-rate ironclads, with the caveat that ammunition would be an issue. So, Warrior, in theory, could solo the Franco-Spanish fleet. The problem is that Warrior doesn't have the ammunition to do that, unless she gets very lucky with Martin shell every shot or something like that. Warrior is effectively, not entirely, but effectively invulnerable to most of what the Franco-Spanish fleet can do to her. She just doesn't have the ammunition capacity to take them all down. And to be honest, even when you get to something like Devastation, yeah, the guns are slightly bigger. And 12-inch HE will do a real number to the Franco-Spanish ships, but the explosive power is still a little bit down compared to what you'd imagine later on, because the explosive type is an older, less powerful explosive. I think if you...
Sorry, I don't know that.
Why is Alexa? I don't know why. Alexa just randomly does these things. I think if you were going to go with earliest ship that could reliably take out the entire French fleet with with its historical ammunition loadout, i.e. an actual limited loadout, I'd probably estimate you're looking at something like the very first pre-dreadnoughts, because you're still effectively invulnerable to cannon fire. You're faster than anything there. You can basically put a couple of 12-inch HE shells with more powerful explosives straight into the bigger targets, and you've got 6 inches with HE which can set fire to and burn out a lot of the other stuff. I think that would probably be the earliest that I would confidently say you could do with your historical ammunition load. The really weird thing is about that Alexa is that, I didn't say any of its start phrases, but it just decided it was going to interject. Anyway. Christopher Ryan asks, if Admiral Fisher walks into his office after taking the position of First Sea Lord and finds complete technical documentation for the construction from raw materials for the following, up to quad auto-loading battleship and cruiser turrets and navalised fission reactors, what does Britain's shipbuilding look like, and how long does it take for any nation with the coast to be singing, if only by proxy, God Save the King? Okay, this is when he's become First Sea Lord, so this is well before World War One. If he's presented with the idea of quadruple auto-loading battleship turrets and, cruiser turrets, I guess, for the Invincibles, and somehow you can power that, and you somehow have cracked both nuclear fission and made it small enough and shielded enough to fit into a ship, yeah, things are going to get very dark for everybody else very quickly. I mean, the main thing, if anything, that's going to hold it up is going to be where are you getting the materials and how much is this stuff going to cost. But yeah, I mean, it's an outside context problem at that point. It's mainly at that point down to just, can you build enough ships to be present everywhere and be pointing menacingly at people? Yeah, that's a slightly terrifying thought. The Judge 2017 asks, what is the probability of USS The Sullivans going down if she'd sustained the same amount of water incursion whilst at war, maybe if she was hit by a torpedo or a bomb, presumably as she did at her mooring? It seems her mooring lines helped keep her upright when she was at her worst. I mean, you know, when the ship's at a point that it capsizes, then yeah, outside of other circumstances, it is going down. So if the amount of water that got into Sullivans, especially given it was in the machinery spaces, got into her while she was at sea fighting, she'd roll over and sink. It's pretty much a given. The flip side to it is, of course, that what happened to the Sullivans was a relatively speaking slow leak that built up over time, and of course most museum ships can't use their own onboard power, whereas in a scenario where if you had that amount of water coming in via roughly the same rate that it did on the Sullivans, then of course you'd have a crew of several hundred people and pumps and portable pumps and damage control parties, etc. So at that point she wouldn't sink because they'd pump all the water out and patch it up before it got too bad. But I mean, to introduce that amount of water in a way that they couldn't patch out and pump out by all at once, you're basically talking about a torpedo hit in the end, which would just be, that's fairly fatal. October Nid asks, what are your thoughts on RimPac 2022? Well, I don't cover modern stuff on the channel. The only thing I will say is that there's a Peruvian corvette at Pearl Harbor that had an engine fire that's apparently the crew are not don't seem very motivated to fix it, because it means the longer it takes their corvette to be fixed, it means they have more shore leave in Hawaii. Other than that, what were your favourite images to come out? I mean, favourite images from RimPacs are going to be things like the big fleet photos. And could the Australians get any more lazy with the name of their supply ship? I don't know what the Australian supply ship was. If it was HMAS Supply, I will facepalm. I'm going to look this up. What is the active... Oh, they literally named their... They named their supply ship HMAS Supply. Oh, come on. That's like RAF Luton levels of lazy. Is their next warship going to be, I don't know, HMAS Warboat? And their next submarine is going to be HMAS Hope It Comes Back Up Again. I mean, come on, I was thinking, what's the absolute laziest, stupidest thing you could possibly call a supply ship? And it turns out someone actually did it. Ay. No, I genuinely think it is impossible to be lazier than that. Oh, wow. That's just special. Ed Schaller asks, it's the second night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Lee, Washington and his crew magically switch locations and allegiances with Kondo, Kirishima and crew. Both sets of commander and crew swapped the knowledge of their respective navies, forces and tactics. How do you think Lee would have approached the battle from the opposite direction, and what do you think the outcome would be? Well, I'm assuming that they are not... I'm assuming that they're not going in with historical knowledge of what they were actually planning to do or what they did, because otherwise it's kind of everything goes to pot because everyone's just making counter moves against moves that haven't happened yet and now won't happen. But assuming they're going in kind of without that, so there's maybe swapping out that noon, the previous noon, let's say. Well, if it's their crews, the main thing is going to be familiarization with the systems, because of course Washington's crew were very dialed into Washington's gun systems and the use of radar. They don't have the use of surface search radar in the Japanese ships, and they don't know how to operate the guns. I mean, they can figure it out, but they're not as finely tuned in with those weapons as they are with the weapons of Washington. And even if they're swapping basic, that'll be the other set of food for Mrs. Drack. Go. Now, yeah, even if they have a basic idea how to operate things, there's knowing how to operate a ship, and then there's knowing that ship back to front. How Lee would approach I mean, his mission is to bombard Henderson Field. The Japanese crew's now in charge of the US ship, so their job is to defend it. See, the Japanese would probably be more aggressive rather than go so the US forces under Japanese command would probably deploy in a more of a line abreast rather than a line ahead. Lee, on the other hand, is probably going to, with as many ships as he's got, will probably adopt maybe a chevroned approach or a two-column approach. If he now knows the full capabilities of the Japanese long lances, I suspect Lee would probably put some destroyers forward first to see what they come into contact with, and then once they come into contact, he would have his tactics be the destroyers drop their torpedoes at short range, high speed settings. His cruisers then drop their torpedoes at long range, slightly lower speed settings, and then his cruisers and battleships or battle cruisers advance behind, or battle cruiser advances behind all of that whilst reloading, taking the surprised enemy hopefully under fire, hopefully the damaged enemy under fire, and finishing them off with a close range torpedo salvo whilst they're under suppressive gunnery. I have a feeling that would be something Lee would probably go for. As to whether or not it would work, I think it depends very much on how the Japanese in the US ships respond, how they're using radar. It would be a little bit more difficult to work out. So I'm just occasionally having some popcorn chicken because I haven't had anything to eat all day apart from breakfast. Colin Ware asks, you've been asked by a wargame publisher to help them out. Okay, what are we helping them out with? Help them handicap their new early World War II tactical naval game, which simulates the outbreak of war in 1939 and goes up to the campaign in the Solomon Islands. They want you to develop a modifier that will take into account the quality of the officers and men of various navies in the game: Britain, Commonwealth, USA, Germany, Italy, Japan, USSR, France. What navies will get the greatest boost and what will have their strengths diminished? I think it's going to depend an awful lot on what scenarios you put them in. Because if you're doing it in terms of the quality of officers and men, then, I mean, if you were going to do very, very crude for each of them, broadly, Britain and the US would probably get a boost to aggressiveness for most of their officers. The The Germans would have some aggressive officers, but then they'd also have a trait of basically you could pay points to get an exceptionally aggressive officer, with the caveat that if you're running a campaign, he'd almost certainly get recalled by Kriegsmarine High Command after 1 or 2 battles. So a short-term boost. The Italians, just based on performance more than anything else, rather than necessary motivation, would have that kind of weirdly kind of success of their officers is inversely proportional to fleet size and tonnage. So you fight destroyer actions with the Italian forces and they get a big boost, but you fight a big fleet action and they get negative modifiers. The Japanese would probably be slightly more cautious than average unless you commit them to a full-on fleet battle, at which point they think the Kantai Kessen has come and it's time. See, I don't know. There's not enough. I don't think there's enough data with the Russians to say with any great deal of certainty how you're going to boost their navy on the basis of their crew quality, because the Russian surface fleet didn't do as much as everybody else's. I mean, you can look at some of the bravery that destroyers like Tashkent, etc., had on the runs to Sevastopol, but those are not open combat scenarios the way that everybody else fought. And France didn't have enough time for their men to... You can't sort of... You can look at certain engagements that the French Navy undertook and how they responded to the French surrender, but you don't have the 3, 4, 5, 6 years of conduct with which to evaluate compared to some of the other nations. Yeah, and then if you were going to introduce weaknesses, then if you're going to introduce weaknesses as well for the some of the bigger navies, I guess for the US, if you're going to have a specific weakness, it would be that you might be you'd probably have a gradual ramping up of experience, so your officers and men would be accumulating experience quite well, so they'd be have quite a high XP curve, with the caveat that they may randomly be replaced for no real apparent reason by somebody who's just toodled out of Pearl Harbor with 0 combat experience, just because they have very slight seniority or something like that. And for Britain and the Commonwealth, again, you might be developing a very experienced set of officers, only to find that, you know, this other location halfway across the planet is in desperate need of ships, and half of your experienced ships and men just get randomly pulled for at random times. So yeah, it's difficult to evaluate. I think if you're wargaming, the ones who probably lose out the most would probably be the Japanese, because they'd become a lot more restrained and cautious, except, as I said, for if you're going to put them up against a full fleet battle. Rob Smith asks, and this is another Nelson one, World War II British destroyers pop up behind him. What flags do the destroyers run up in reply to Nelson's? Okay, so basically this is Nelson hoists England expects. It's a group of then World War II British destroyers magically appear astern of his fleet. How do the destroyers run up in reply to run up their flags in reply to Nelson? I mean, given this is if you're talking about the World War II Royal Navy, especially British destroyers, so you've got very aggressive destroyer commanders. Yes, thank you. I know the food has arrived. You've got very aggressive British destroyer commanders. Nelson has kind of been raised to the status of a demigod in the Navy, and they are going to recognise the situation they're in. Once the destroyer captains have gotten over the emotional impact of it, then they will probably hoist they'll hoist the standard, acknowledgement, and then of course after England expects comes down, the last signal that victory puts up is engage the enemy more closely, at which point the destroyers are going to very, 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 very gladly acknowledge that, ramp up to 30 knots and charge. Hello there, Legacy. That would just be, they'll just be like, we fully embrace this concept. HMS Inadvisable asks, if you're in charge of the Unrotated Projectile program, how would you have made it an effective ship-based anti-aircraft weapon, if at all possible? You can use any technology that was trialled successfully before the end of World War II, but you must keep it unguided. So I think I spoke about this in a Drydock before, but it was quite a while back. In theory, the Unrotated Projectile launcher could have been somewhat successful. In the late war. In the early war, there isn't really much you can do to make it a successful thing. But if it was, I don't know, maybe the launchers were just kept in storage until the late war when the kamikaze threat comes about, then what I would do is fix a proximity fuse to the front of it, because those projectiles are more than big enough to handle one, and replace the ridiculous aerial mine concept with just a really big shrapnel charge, because you see the size of these things, they're pretty hefty compared to even heavy anti-aircraft shells, at which point they kind of become very limited shot but probably fairly effective blanket fire, like last ditch defenses, because you link them into radar guided fire control, and then once the enemy aircraft has gotten within the minimum engagement range of your heavy AA and you're having to rely on 20mm and 40mm to hopefully chew them up, you have this other thing of basically, just blast an incoming Zero in the face with half a dozen very large rocket-propelled shrapnel charges on proximity fuses. So that would be I think, the best way you could use the Unrotated Projectile launcher. Donovan asks, he says, hey Drek, you get a lot of alt history or what if questions. This is true. That said, I'm curious, what are your alternate history - what if questions? Where do you ask them, and of who? And where do your fans find them? My alternate history - what if questions and speculations, I either try and answer them myself by working through things, bit by bit, and occasionally you see the fruits of those pop up with things like, what if Task Force 34 had been at Samar, the Battle of the Texel, which incidentally at some point I will redo the Battle of the Texel video. I'll make a few minor corrections, like not calling the Dutch coast occupied and hostile, but the main thing is that video is graphics wise my hilariously terrible attempts with MS Paint. So I will probably hire a 3D artist, or someone who's really good with 3D rendering, and just get them to recreate my awful MS Paint stuff in basic 3D modeling, just so the graphics are much improved, maybe with a little bit of animation. That's something I want to do. But in terms of generally, if I'm going to ask people about alt history what if, pre-COVID it would have been the model wargaming group that I was part of. It hasn't really kicked off again post COVID, unfortunately. So nowadays mostly I pester other historians. I try and find out, who do I know who's got a lot of knowledge in this field of naval history that I'm thinking of what if about, or who's written a book about it, and then I go and pester them and say, hi, usually hopefully people already know, and say, well, what do you think about this? How would this go? Here's my initial thoughts. Tell me why I'm right or wrong. And it kind of goes, that's usually where my history stuff comes from. Well, where my personal questions get answered anyway. Okay, so we're 2/3 of the way through the alt history stuff. Just have another chicken. Megascro asks, okay, so this requires some knowledge of Star Trek. He says, you're a NACL agent fed up with the Temporal Cold War, so you go back in time to the Channel period to cause as much... To the Channel period... Oh, so going back to the 1850s, 1950s, to cause as much chaos as possible. To avoid being detected, you can only do 3 acts. Things you can do are limited in scale, such as block, alter, or make orders, save or kill someone, sabotage or repair equipment. You can't do big things such as give technology away. How do you mess up the timeline? Okay. If I can only do stuff like that, then if I want to completely mess with the timeline as compared to how it worked out these in reality, swap British and German propellant in World War One. What else? You can't make steel impossible. Sabotaging the Bessemer process, other people already working on it, so you can't get rid of steel armor. I mean, I'd be tempted to go to that radar station on Hawaii and tell them, no, that is actually a bunch of Japanese aircraft. But the problem with that is that altering Pearl Harbor... no, I would do that, because altering Pearl Harbor so that the US Navy has warning, it's not going to reduce... I mean, the reduced casualties might slightly reduce the ire that the US is feeling towards Japan, but the fact they were sneak attacked in and of itself, even if that sneak attack, wasn't very successful, is probably going to do enough. What would my other third act be? Yeah, actually, that's a good point, Knight 6831. I would probably turn around and tell... If I can be really sneaky and just say the Allies generally, but more specifically France and Britain, that you should invest in upgrading your infrastructure, your shipyards and so forth in size, and get them to start doing that in the early 1910s or maybe the late 1910s, immediately post-war, because having much larger shipyards and dockyards, etc., will quite radically change what is then built and how quickly in the 1920s. Massive point out, yeah, also, well, the thing is, if I can only block, alter, or make orders, the thing is, telling people the Mark 14 torpedoes suck, a lot of people were already saying that. I'd have to kill a lot of people in Buord before anything actually got done. Alternate historian Turtleduck, how were the tonnage limits for the capital ships decided on for the Washington Naval Treaty, and what would happen if it was instead decided to have a limited number of ships but still have the gun limit be 16 inches for battleships and 8 inches for cruisers? So I have a feeling that the first part of that question, I think, is actually in this week's recorded Drydock. But very, very quickly and basically, it was a case of what's the gun size and tonnage that people are currently building their ships at, and then very slightly rounding that up. So, 33,000, 34,000 tons becomes 35,000. 16 inch stays at 16 inch. Cruiser tonnage and gun caliber goes from sort of 7.5 to 8 or 8.1 technically, and rounds up to about 10,000 tons. It's basically just rounding up slightly or keeping at the limitations of what's currently being built. One of the big, because basically the Japanese weren't going to give up Nagato and Mutsu, the Americans weren't going to give up the Colorados, all three of them, which meant that there was no chance of, downrating the gun limit to 15 inches or downrating the tonnage to 30,000 tons or something like that. That was just never going to be on the cards. So there was that minimum floor, but they also didn't want to leave room open for bigger and nastier and meaner ships to be built, especially when the British were saying we need a couple of 16-inch ships ourselves. So, if you'd agreed for a 40,000 ton limit, then obviously the British would build the Nelsons at 40,000 tons, and then you'd have, from everybody else's perspective, a major problem. Robert Sokal asks, what produces the sound of hammers in your sound intro to the Drydock questions? The high-pitched strike. Is it a real repairing tool or just a musical instrument? From what I recall of listening to it, I think it is genuinely hammers being struck. I can't think of any musical instrument that makes that noise. Not unless maybe someone hit the biggest xylophone key or something whilst holding on to it to stop the reverb. I'm pretty sure it's actual hammers. Magical Sparkly Ship Girl asks, what effect on naval war in World War I would 3 more ships of the Tiger class have produced, especially at Dogger Bank and Jutland, if they'd been ordered, bought and crewed by the Royal Canadian Navy? Okay, so if you've got 3 Royal Canadian Navy Tigers, that's a good one. I mean, they'd obviously be called into the Royal Navy the same way that New Zealand and Australia... New Zealand was quite quickly, and Australia was eventually. Now, the interesting, because then if you've got a Dogger Bank... I mean, obviously it gives the battlecruiser fleet a much greater numerical advantage. So at Dogger Bank, it probably means that Dogger Bank ends worse for the Germans because there's just so many more British ships. If there's 3 additional Tigers, it's probably just an absolute. Jutland is a really interesting one though, because if you've got 3 more Tigers, which is, depending on the time period, it pretty much is an additional battle cruiser squadron, so they're now 4th battle cruiser squadron. Theoretically, that means that BT can release 3rd battle cruiser squadron to go and play in Scapa Flow without successfully demanding 5th battle squadron. So on the one hand, you're not going to have 5th battle squadron riding to the rescue on the run to the south. On the other hand, you probably going to have 4th battle squadron riding in a battle cruiser squadron riding in a lot closer formation with BT, so they're going to be there from the start. At which point, whether it goes better or worse for them is probably going to come down to how well fire control discipline is kept, because we know obviously at Jutland there was issues with various British battle cruisers choosing the wrong targets and so forth. With so many additional battle cruisers, even if some choose the wrong targets, there's probably a fairly good chance that all of First Scouting Group will be under fire by somebody. And so, I mean, that many guns firing, hits will rack up fairly quickly. But with the various shell issues, the fact that Tigers are not as well protected as 5th Battle Squadron, the run to the south might go slightly better for BT initially, but then the hitting power towards the end of it is not going to be as great because you don't have as many or as powerful broadsides as when 5th Battle Squadron finally shows up. And then who exactly is going to stop the High Seas Fleet from taking a chunk out of the battlecruiser fleet when it turns around to run away is another matter, as again, because you don't have 5th Battle Squadron. It's probably, I mean, on the other hand, 4th Battle Cruiser Squadron is probably not going to miss the turn signal, but they're also a lot more vulnerable than the Queen Elizabeths are. So yeah, the possible outcomes of a Jutland where you've got the battle cruiser fleet with 3 additional Tigers but not 5th Battle Squadron, that's actually a really intriguing potential, I think. Let's put the recorded super chats over there. Right. Patrick Donnelly asks, considering the US Navy was just starting to experiment with helicopters at the end of World War II, would it have been possible for USS Enterprise CV-6 to have been converted into a prototype LPH landing platform helicopter? Theoretically, yes. The practical problem with that would be, again, the surfeit of Essexes, especially in the latter part of the 1940s, even before the kind of major reactivations you saw in the 50s. There were just so many Essexes that if people were looking for an experimental LPH platform, the Essexes are bigger and they're in better condition. Enterprise was really heavily worn by the war. Obviously it got damaged a lot, and so it was also somewhat patched up. And of course Bunk Hill and Franklin, 2 entirely repaired, reconditioned Essexes, never even came back out of the reserves. So any proposal where someone says, well, we want to turn CV-6 into a LPH is going to be met with, well, why don't we just use an Essex? The only potential argument being, well, if CV-6 is smaller, then it might cost less and would be maybe a prototype from whom we could apply the lessons to, like, full service LPHs made of Essexes. That might persuade somebody, but I wouldn't necessarily put money on it. The response would probably either be, we can just use an Essex and get a more accurate one-for-one for other Essexes, or pointing out, you know, it's an incredibly worn-out ship. I suppose the counter-argument to that would be, well, this is its last duty. We basically get the very, very last drops of usefulness out of it and then scrap it. But then again, people might say, well, yeah, but we also don't want to have to deal with 50 billion mechanical issues whilst we're also trying to work out how to operate helicopters. Dave Collier, that's definitely going to be a fun Friday video. This is a card game he sent me called England Expects. That's going to be a fun Friday later this year. Don't worry, I've been having fun. John Edward Dietz asks, when the Great Eastern is launched, all of Parliament is sold and will buy into the idea of a new fleet based on her design or derivations of it. Wow, the opium trade must be doing a roaring trade in Westminster, given how difficult it was to launch that thing. But effectively, a new blank check is given to this task. What do you envision this new fleet would look like? And what do you believe the rest of the world would be thinking? The rest of the world will probably be thinking that Britain has gone mad. I mean, bearing in mind Great Eastern predates a lot of shipping. But as I say, given the sheer cost of building her, some of the issues she had while being run, and the absolute, cacophony of errors that was her launch, if somebody had turned around and said, right, the Royal Navy is now going to basically be building Great Easterns as their main line, I mean, it would scare people a lot, because those things are huge compared to everything else that is around at the time. But there'd be a relatively limited number of them. Plus, also, you've got to convert it eventually into being an ironclad. I mean, if you're going to do absolute ideal, ideal outcome would be the Royal Navy takes just long enough delaying everything until the idea of ironclad ships is slightly more fully developed so that they can rework the design somewhat into an ironclad design as opposed to just an iron hull design from the start. Although then the potential of HMS Warrior launching in response to La Gloire and launching as a weaponized armoured Great Eastern instead of the Warrior that we all know, I mean, it would be a statement. The rest of the world would probably be very angry, and, well, the French at least would be desperately trying to find a shipyard capable of being upgraded to be large enough to respond. But yeah, weaponized ironclad Great Easterns would be interesting, especially given that by the time of Warrior, the screw propeller drive had probably improved enough they could dispense with the paddle wheels. That would be, yeah. This kind of motivates me to try again, and someone sent me some basic 3D renders. Actually, I mean, okay, it's not as many people viewing as maybe we'll view some of the other videos, but if any of you out there happen to want, who are, pretty decent 3D artists and would like a commission job to be completed by 1st of April next year that involves basically taking the Great Eastern's hull and turning it into 15 different types of warships, actually more like half a dozen, for a hilarious April Fool's, then get in contact. Because I have some ideas, but not anywhere near the artistic talent to pull it all off. So we've got 3 more questions before the long one, and then we're done with the Patreon stuff. So the almighty Hypnotoad, some way or another, Isambard Kingdom Brunel hears the song The Irish Rover and thinks to himself, yes, I can build that. Given how ridiculous the ship is in the song and Brunel's great talent for building unsinkable ships, what would the dimensions and service history of Brunel's Irish Rover be? Okay, well, this I've got to see. Irish Rover lyrics. 23 masts. Yeah, okay, that I can see that. I can see Brunel taking that as a challenge. That's a lot of cargo. Uh, 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, 27... 30, 35 million barrels. Okay. I've got to convert barrels to TEU now. Okay, that's a lot. Okay, so we may have run into a slight problem with this idea. So if you look at the Irish Rover song and add together as many million barrels as they are saying they're carrying, and then you run barrel to TEU converter, that suggests that, I mean, yeah, you'd need 23 sails to get this thing to move, 23 masts, because you're looking at a ship that, roughly speaking, would need to be carrying 120,000 TEU, and the largest available container ship at the moment is 24,000 TEU. So you're talking about a ship with a cargo capacity that is about 5 times greater than the biggest cargo container ship on the planet at the moment. Yeah, that's... Brunel could almost certainly design such a thing. I have no conception of anywhere in Victorian Britain that could actually build such a thing, though. I mean, yeah, that'd just be... You'd be talking about a ship that's got a displacement in the that is, you know, probably mid 6 figures. Yeah. That would just be... That would be insane. If he somehow managed to find a shipyard, or probably build a shipyard capable of having a ship of that size constructed, A, it'd probably barely be able to move under its own power at the time, but B, it would be such a vast vessel, and given Brunel's penchant for designing unbreakable things, it would probably still be around today. It would be, I mean, it probably would have survived the 2 world wars quite happily, because even if someone had put a torpedo in it, it would probably take like half a day for anyone to notice. Salty Viking 10,022 asks, how would Yamato and Musashi fare against the Grand Fleet from the Battle of Jutland? How many ships would they take down with them? So that's a relatively common question that's come up. Assuming we're talking about, you know, very late war models where they have basic radar and everything, it's kind of an ammunition quantity limit question. They can outrange the Grand Fleet. Even though they've got relatively basic radar, they can still see the Grand Fleet, which is going to make things very interesting come nightfall and so forth. They can obviously give sheer warning where the Grand Fleet is. So yeah, in terms of how many ships they take down, basically how long is a piece of string, because it's more a case of how accurate can they get their gunfire, which is obviously going to get more accurate as they get closer. How close do they want to get, and how many shells are they going to expend per ship that they cripple or destroy? Daniel Silverthorne, which is the last Patreon question prior to the big long one, asks, what would have happened if the US and German fleets near Samoa in the late 1880s had come to blows? Would the US Navy of that time have stood a chance against the German Navy of that time, or would Germany have suffered defeat at the hands of the US Navy? Both the US Navy and the German fleet in the late 1880s are not exactly very large when it comes, well, period, or when it comes to overseas commitments. That's why the forces at Samoa are a bunch of smaller ships, because the late 1880s, the US is beginning to put plans in train that will lead to USS Maine and USS Texas, but they're still mostly in the post-American Civil War doldrums of, not having much built at all. And the Germans are, similar to the US in some ways, in the process of ramping up towards building their run of pre-dreadnoughts, but still have a very mixed and scattered fleet that reaches back a fair way. The German Navy probably has slightly more heavy ocean-going craft to its name in the immediate future, but the problem they're going to have is that a lot of their larger long-distance ocean-going craft, in terms of like ironclads and so forth, are older, so they'd hold a theoretical initial advantage going after tiny little islands like Samoa, but both nations are starting from such a low point that the US, if it gets stacked together and starts building lots of ships quickly, can fairly comfortably overhaul the Germans in a matter of a few years. Right, so we have the last Patreon question, which is submitted by somebody who says their name is read as Okage, I think. Okage? Okage? No, Okage. It's got to be Okage. It's Japanese characters, maybe? Anyway. Right, so the Japanese see the Paris guns at the end of World War II and are I'm guessing they mean World War One, and are impressed. So it says, I'll just change that to World War One so I don't get confused. Their next super battleship, Yamato, has to have a pair, so they're going to introduce the Paris gun onto the Yamato. Okay. I'm just reading the question to try and summarize it. Okay, so there's, I think there's a little bit of confusion with the question, because the Paris gun is a very long barrel, slightly sub-caliber weapon of World War One, whereas I think the bulk of the question is asking about putting a pair of Schwere Gustav guns on Yamato with something approximating a reasonable rate of fire. And Schwere Gustav is, of course, the much, much, much larger 31-inch guns. A sketch design of the Yamato scaled up to incorporate a twin Schwere Gustav turret. Now, well, as much as such a thing can be considered seriously, if we were going to seriously consider the possibility of a battleship mounting a twin 31-inch turret, I don't think you'd need to expand the Yamatos that much. I think what you'd basically have to, or if at all, I think what you basically have to do would just be to completely remove the two forward 1818s and all their associated equipment, and just have one twin 31.5 or 31-inch turret. Because the gun itself, compared to an 18-inch gun, is, I mean, it's a lot bigger, but it volumetrically is not too bad. I think if you had the entire forward section of it, I think maybe you'd also have to drop the forward 666. But if you then use that area, you could probably fit a twin 31-inch just about, weight-wise, size-wise, etc. And then he says, if it's assuming that, I mean, you'd basically be creating a gigantic monitor at that point. Yeah, as Aluminium Fence is pointing out. How would a successfully navalized 31-inch gun capable of shooting 50 kilometers perform? The main problem with the range is going to be, one, the accuracy, because you're now a moving target potentially shooting another moving target, well over the horizon, which means aerial spotting is very definitely a thing. At which point you're probably going to drop the aft 18 in favour of just more aircraft, because you're going to need a constant relay of spotting aircraft to tell you what's going on at the other end. And then, if it's decided this Yamato will take part in the Pearl Harbor attack, what kind of damage could it do to the oil farms, dry docks, ammunition bunkers, and workshops? Assuming it has uncanny accuracy, huge. If it's got uncanny accuracy, huge amounts. I mean, we saw what a single Schwere Gustav could do to an underground magazine, which was itself armoured and under a bunch of water. So, of all the things you could direct its shells at, the dry docks and ammo bunkers will probably be the best things to fire at, because an individual shell would instantly wipe out one of the oil storage tanks, but there's an awful lot of them with a lot of interlocking measures to stop the fires spreading. So put a pair of 31-inch shells into a dry dock gate, you've probably wrecked the dry dock. Whereas you use that same salvo against the oil farms, you've broken at best two, maybe one or two more oil tanks. and the reload time, even with a hypothetical like mechanical autoloader, is still going to take a bit. Assuming success, how would the Americans respond to these shells coming in? They can't really. The best they could do would be maybe, if they realise that this ship has to be somewhat closer than the Japanese aircraft carriers, would be maybe to launch all remaining aircraft that they have to try and find it and harass it. And maybe, just maybe, tell Enterprise where it is, and maybe get Enterprise to try and launch an airstrike on it. How would the damage, if they shot up the dry docks and ammo bunkers, affect the course of the war? It's going to delay it quite a bit. I mean, if you blow up most of the ammunition bunkers at Pearl Harbor, in and of itself, that's going to do a bunch more damage. And if the dry docks are damaged, then they're going to have to repair and rebuild the dry docks before they can repair and dry dock all the battleships. And if the dry docks are out of action generally, then they also don't have the dry docks to repair other active warships. So it's going to significantly slow down the pace of the Pacific War. Probably delay it by about a year, I would say. And then similarly, if the original Yamato was ready in time and bombarded Pearl Harbor, what damage would occur? So our fantasy hyper-accurate Schwerer-Gustav Yamato monitor aside, if Yamato herself was ready in time and tried to bombard Pearl Harbor, she probably would have been sunk. Because, her accuracy firing over land to try and hit stuff inside Pearl Harbor wouldn't be anywhere near as good as our hypothetical hyper-accurate long-range monitor. She would have been spotted coming in, so there'd be aircraft and destroyers and so forth ready for her, and as I said, Enterprises coming in, so she'd probably be swarmed death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, there were a bunch of American subs coming in on that day who'd probably just vector in to try and take her out. And last bit of that long question would be, where else would this Super Yamato be used and how? Probably in various invasions, I would imagine. Various invasion efforts, Corregidor, for example. Basically anywhere that there's a large fortification or set of potentially explosive bunkers to be blown up, that's where this thing would go. So Singapore, as I said, Singapore, Corregidor. The problem is something that with that much firepower but a relatively slow rate of fire and only 2 guns, it basically is a shore attack platform for the most part. And there's actually not that many targets in the Western Pacific worthy of its attention, in part thanks to the Washington Treaty preventing everyone from fortifying the place. So hopefully that does that. So that is the last that's the last Patreon question. So now I need to see if I can catch up on the super chats, because we ended up chasing them quite a while last week. So the first one is Christian Slot Hulk asks, what is the particular difference in doctrine and armament for World War II motor gunboats and motor torpedo boats? Okay, so the two kind of start merging towards the end of the war, but in some ways, this is the Royal Navy, the motor gunboats and motor torpedo boats almost reflect either the torpilla, contra torpilla in the Marine Nationale, or the initial torpedo boat destroyer and torpedo boat paradigms of the late 19th century, and obviously with the Marine Nationale of the 1930s and 40s. So initially, the idea of the motor gunboats was to basically be the anti-fast attack craft, fast attack craft, and the motor torpedo boats were, well, as their name suggests, designed to carry torpedoes with relatively minimal gun, if any, gun armament to attack enemy large warships, destroyers and upwards. So the motor gunboats would ride escort for them, and the motor gunboats would also patrol separately to them to try and take out enemy motor torpedo boats or equivalent thereof. But as time went on, the motor torpedo boats tended to get larger, and as they got larger, they acquired relatively substantial gun armaments of their own, and the motor gunboats also got larger and faster, and they, whilst improving their gun armament towards the end, also started to acquire maybe the odd torpedo launcher of their own. So initially the doctrine and armament is quite separate, where, as I said, the motor torpedo boat is almost just a torpedo boat with a few light guns on it, and the motor gunboat is quite heavily armed. By the end of World War II, they've near enough effectively merged, and there's the last generations of motor gunboat and motor torpedo boat in 1945. As I said, the armament is very, very similar, just with maybe a very slight balance one way or the other. Although the motor gunboats do tend to have quite, for their size, quite heavy bits of artillery. Ian Brannan asks, if you were head of the Canadian Navy just before World War II and could choose any ship from any nation, how would you build the Canadian Navy for World War II? Well, if I'm going to be practical, the problem is if it's just before World War II, and I know the Canadian Navy is going to be needed on the Atlantic routes, I'd basically just start building more Flower class sooner, because that's really the only design that's available at the time that is suitable for what the Canadian Navy is going to be asked to do. What the heck? Sorry, that's going on mute now. Yeah, because, I mean, it might be tempting to say, oh, well, actually, I'll build some River class or something like that. But realistically, you're not going to have access to that design because it doesn't exist yet. It might also be tempting to say, oh, I'll build a ton of Fletcher class, but one, I won't be able to build anywhere near as many, and two, whilst the Fletcher class has many strengths, hunting subs is not really one of them. And US destroyer escort designs, again, are a few years in the future. So if I'm being very, very practical, as the head of the Canadian Navy prior to World War II, I'd just be building lots of Flower class early, and maybe a few sloops, because they're also pre-war design. The sloops would be slightly variant. Yeah, that would be how I'd build the Canadian Navy for World War II, because that's what they turn out to be very, very good at. Asking the Canadian infrastructure and industry to build anything substantially larger is not really that practical. I mean, you look at the Australian Navy, they got their cruisers from Britain. They didn't really, after one experiment with Brisbane, they didn't really go for building large numbers of cruisers in their own shipyards, because that's just the way the infrastructure is. So yeah. Redacted asks, what if at the launch of HMS Dreadnought all the US pre-dreadnoughts are replaced 50-50 with a split of Iowa and Montana class battleships in an immediate post-1945 configuration? The US rules the waves? I mean, the Americans didn't have the world's biggest pre-dreadnought fleet by any measure, but they had a fair number of them. And if you've got, mental calculations, if you've got something approximating in the region of 24 Iowas and Montanas, so maybe you've got double-digit figures of both in post-1945 configuration with radar-guided anti-aircraft gunnery, and the fact they're just 50 to 60, maybe even pushing 70,000 on full load in the case of Montana. Battleships capable of either 728 or 33-ish knots. There's nothing anyone can do to oppose that. Everybody else's machinery isn't as efficient. Even if they could build a ship that large, they wouldn't be able to fit it out with as bigger guns or as advanced fire control tech or anything like that. It would just be, okay, well, I guess the US are the new masters of the ocean, unless someone can steal the things from them. Hugh Gordon, that would be Palle Rasmussen. He's actually just a couple of chats above you. Is getting a new ferret, which I approve of greatly. William Potts asks, when Washington conveyed Hiroshima to the seafloor between two slices of bread, do you think it's possible that if radar was somehow eliminated, that such an engagement could become the norm, or bring back battleships, or could bring back battleships? If radar is eliminated, I don't think it's going to necessarily bring back battleships, because radar is not vital to the work of the aircraft carrier, which is what ends up displacing the battleship as the capital ship of the fleet. If radar's eliminated, I think actually the kind of point blank ambush engagement that Washington fights against Hiroshima is actually enabled by one side having radar and the other not. I mean, it's possible that, fighting at night, short range, sharp actions between capital ships could become more the norm if for any other reason, just to stay out of the way of aircraft. But it would be a lot more fraught and a lot more random if both sides are going in without radar, because then it's down to who spots who first, and that can get very dicey and even shorter range potentially. Whereas with radar you get obviously Washington versus Hiroshima, but radar also enables engagements like Duke of York versus Scharnhorst, these kind of 9 to 12,000 yard ambushes where one side can see, prepare, and put all the guns on bearing, and then fire at the last possible moment. So yeah, if radar's eliminated, it's not going to stop the aircraft carrier ultimately, and it might actually mean without radar even fewer radar battleship engagements, because if it's down to a roll of the dice of who's got better night vision, people might become even more cagey about putting capital ships out at night than they were historically. Fleet of Oceans, did you manage to get Battle of Procyon working? And if so, has it measured up to what you remember? Yes and yes. Have you managed to play it since the last live Drydock? Yeah, well, I played it for about an hour to get my familiarity back, but because I was prepping for Tiger Day this weekend, I didn't get much else in, because I was prepping for Tiger Day and trying to get stuff ready for my reenactment group, and trying to get the 5.5 hour Patreon Drydocks that went up, so didn't have a huge amount of time available. Jeff C asks, I'm curious if Drac has or is looking into the history of Commonwealth shipbuilding during World War II. It is something I'm interested in, and it is something I want to do a video on at some point in the future, but it's probably what I would term a medium-term project, i.e. it's measured in single-digit years. Because there's it's not something that's very well covered outside of the native countries. I've been to Canada, I've picked up a couple of resources for that, but I have yet to go Antipodean, so I need to do that at some point. Maxwell Looney, if your favourite alternate history actually happened, an 1890-ish Battle of the Thames Estuary with a combined French and Russian fleet, what would the ramifications be come World War I or World War II? I mean, fleet-wise, there's not going to be a huge amount of ramifications, because all the ships that are happening that are around in 1890-ish are hopelessly obsolete by World War II, and the few that actually exist are going to be in like tertiary roles. The biggest ramifications will be from the sort of the unknowable roll of the dice of which officers who would go on to form parts of the senior command staff in World War I may have come a cropper in that battle. And I mean, on the one hand, I'd be tempted to say, a massive 1890s Thames Estuary fleet battle between the British and the French and Russians would break the idea of the Triple Entente. But then again, relations between Britain, France and Russia in 1890 weren't especially brilliant anyway. And from 1890 to World War One is 24 years, where in Tsushima to World War One is 10. But the Japanese and Russians kind of got on to a degree, fighting alongside each other in World War One, and the Japanese even sold the Russians back a bunch of the ships the Japanese had taken off of them in the Russo-Pacific War. So, whilst it might be tempting to say it's going to change the sides in World War One completely, the quickness at which geopolitics shifted in that period would suggest it might not. Bizarre as it is to say, the way global politics were shifting in the 1890s and 1900s, you could literally have a knockdown, drag-out fight in the Thames Estuary of Britain versus France and Russia. And by 1910 to 1914, in terms of actual ships, it wouldn't matter because everything would have been replaced anyway. And it may well have, they may well still be allies, even if there may be a little bit of bad blood from people who died. I think the single biggest thing that you can reliably predict coming out of it would be potentially officers that we never heard of in real life being promoted because of valorous action in that battle, and other officers that we have heard of potentially being in that battle and being lost in that battle, and then we lose their services, further down the line. Redacted says, speaking of your death ride of the Imperial German Navy, so that's the Battle of Texel, what do you think the after effects of the battle you wargamed would be? Okay, so my theoretical Battle of the Texel 1918, the effects on the Royal Navy would be huge. They've had their new Jutland, so the people involved would be lauded as heroes. By the time of World War II, you'd have ships named after them, etc., etc. It's what the Royal Navy would have wanted from the beginning. For the US Navy, it's the first time the US Navy's got a battleship action going. Of course, poor old USS Texas will become even more of a legend than she is in our reality, because, well, she's blown her engines out desperately trying to engage the Germans and succeeded in doing so. So, go Texas. In terms of the wider geopolitics, I mean, it's eliminated a good chunk of the German fleet, which is good for the British. The British were secretly somewhat pleased with the scuttling at Scapa Flow because it meant no one else could get their hands on the German fleet. But I mean, I think actually in terms of overall geopolitics, the single biggest and most interesting effect that battle might have would be on whether or not World War II happens in the way that we recognise it, because the rise of the Nazi Party in 1930s Germany was helped in part by the whole stab in the back myth. We were never defeated, we were betrayed by internal enemies, blah 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 blah. Whereas if there's this decisive, honourable battle that people can point to, even if it's defeat, it makes it harder to promulgate the stab in the back myth. I mean, I suppose there could be some modified version of we only lost because XYZ, but given the balance of forces, that would be a very tenuous and difficult argument to come up to maintain. So yeah, it might actually, by being this kind of set piece, honourable, quote unquote, stand-up fight that maybe precipitates the Germans giving up when they lose it, that might actually severely hamper the stab in the back myth, which then hampers the Nazis in their attempts to rise to power in the 30s, which is not necessarily something I was thinking of when I initially wargamed that battle out. Miles McCaskill asks, a large submarine with no torpedoes, an offset sail and a full-length steam catapult powered by a diesel boiler set up to fire Barnes-Wallis bouncing bombs in 1944. Plausible or effective? I mean, highball, the kind of at-sea variant of the bouncing bomb, did need to be launched from mosquitoes at altitude, but in theory, a steam catapult could fire them up into the air high enough. I mean, technically speaking, a bouncing bomb launching submarine is not impossible with World War II tech, although I'd love to be a fly on the wall of the meeting that had to come up with the watertight seals and everything for the catapult while it's going under the water. I would question its effectiveness partially on the grounds that, you know, to set it all up would require a fair bit of time, and any anti-submarine escort worth its salt is going to turn around and shoot at the sub in question before it's ready. The other thing I have some hesitation with is that the speed the bouncing bombs need to achieve to get their effect going. I mean, maybe a steam catapult could deliver that to a relatively speaking lightweight payload like a bouncing bomb. But I would have some questions about whether or not a steam catapult existed that was powerful enough to launch a 4.5-ton bouncing bomb, not just forward with enough speed, but also high enough. So it would have to actually be going faster than the launch speed of a bouncing bomb, because it would have to lose some of the energy launching it high enough into the air to set up the backspin, and also setting up the backspin. I have my doubts. It might be doable. It might be, but it wouldn't be a very effective weapon, unfortunately, purely because of the setup time once you're on the surface. UNSC Forward on to Dawn asks, it's 1940, you've been asked to design a supercruiser. What the? That was bizarre. Anyway. Where were we? UNSC Forward on to Dawn. 1940, you've been asked to design a supercruiser for Australia. It can be built in any friendly nation, but must fit in an existing dry dock at Cockatoo Dockyard. Okay, right. First things first. How big is Cockatoo Dockyard's dry docks? Fitzroy Dock. $145 meters long. $145 meters in feet. 469 feet. Ooh, that's not too long. 469 feet. Okay, you can't get county class in that. Cockatoo Island Dry Dock. Okay, well, let's look at the map and see what the biggest one is. Sutherland Dock looks like it might be a bit bigger. Okay, that's 210 meters long, and it can fit a heavy cruiser. Okay, so 210 meters in... Why would I want it in inches? Okay, 688. Okay. 688 feet, 690 feet. That's plausible. Let's get some sizes. I mean, you're not going to... A supercruiser's not going to be that big. 688 feet. So you're not going to... yeah, you're not going to build anything Alaska size, because Alaska is, you know, about 800 foot long. So you're over 100 feet too short for that. I'm just wondering if maybe some of the 9.2 inch ships that the British were designing might be able to fit in there. Let's have a quick look at their specs. 210 meters. Okay, so the 3 quadruple 9.2 inch ship is a couple of meters too long for the Sutherland dock, but its width would suggest you might just be able to wedge it in at an angle. Some bigger versions, which obviously that's not helping matters. 3 triple 9.2s, it's about the same length, 213 meters. Yeah, okay, so some of the smaller supercruiser designs could fit. Okay, so if the limitation is it's got to fit on the Cockatoo Island dock, then and you want a supercruiser, then you are basically looking at maybe just about squeezing in the 3 quad 9.2 inch early design, which I think is the Gibraltar in World of Warships, or it may be the Monmouth, the one they're bringing in now. But yeah, that's basically pushing right up to the very limits of what you can fit in there. Because Alaska's too big. Dunkirk's too big. Yeah. I wonder how long a Salem is. Or a Des Moines. Maybe a Des Moines would fit. 700 foot. Oh, okay. That's actually almost... The Des Moines almost exactly the same length as the proposed 9.2 inch supercruiser. But if it's 1940, the Des Moines autoloader systems haven't been developed yet. So yeah, if it's 1940 and I'm building a supercruiser for Australia, then basically I'm going to be building the 1938 3 quad 9.2 inch supercruiser and see how that goes. 11th, the next one asks, why have Navy vessels been capped at 32 knots since World War II? Do you think modern nuclear carriers could go faster? No, they haven't been capped at 32 knots. What's happened is that the officially acknowledged speed is that. I mean, you do get some ridiculous things like... I don't know if it's changed recently, but up until at least very recently, the official US Navy line on their fast attack subs was that they can go deeper than 300 feet and faster than 20 knots, which is a case of, yes, you are technically correct, but also that's incredibly misleading because, you know, US fast attack subs are a lot faster than 20 knots. So yeah, it's not that they've capped the speed at 32 knots, but I think that's the 33 knots is about as fast as they'll officially acknowledge their ships can go. There are plenty of post-World War II US Navy ships that can exceed 32 knots. They just may not necessarily admit that that is the thing that could happen. Nikolai FR, if Norway had decided to purchase HMS Gorgon and order a replacement for Glatton, or buy 2 brand new ships of the Bjorgvig class, the class that became Gorgon and Glatton after World War I, would it affect the German invasion in any way? If they bought 2 new ones, possibly not, because they'd still be largely outdated by World War II, because the Norwegians didn't seem to show any particular interest in upgrading their vessels. However, if they'd purchased Gorgon and a replacement Glatton, that could have significantly affected the German invasion. And the main reason I say that is because the Bjorgvigs, and I apologise because I'm probably mispronouncing it, and as designed, have only marginally better torpedo protection than the Eidsvolds, which is to say not much. But of course, Glatton famously took multiple torpedoes to put down even when she was moored and stationary because of the massive bulges that the Royal Navy had fitted to her. So if you have Gorgon and Glatton under new Norwegian names either replacing or supplementing the Eidsvolds in the defence of Narvik, that's going to be a very, very different issue, because they're going to have updated fire control systems compared to the Eidsvolds, but with those massive, massive bulges. Whereas both Norge and Eidsvold went down fairly quickly after the German ships put a torpedo into them. In this scenario, the Germans can put quite a number of torpedoes into them, and it's not actually really going to stop them at all. At which point their heavy armament will come in and probably start smashing up German destroyers in a way they really, really don't want to be smashed up. So potentially you may not have... Well, I mean, you might still have a second Battle of Narvik, because there's still a lot of German destroyers, a lot of torpedoes, and a lot of gunfire that can be directed their way. So they might eventually go down, but not before they do a serious amount of damage. So you will probably still have a second Battle of Narvik with Warburton Lee's destroyers, but they may now be in a position of coming in to mop up the survivors of the German destroyer force, rather than taking them on almost from scratch, which means you almost near enough certainly won't get a third Battle of Narvik, because there won't be anything to fight, really. Stephen Meyer asks, Lexington's finishing with triple 14-inch as planned, and repulsor Renown built in response to Washington, or finishing the last hulls as fast orders after the Washington Naval. Okay. How am I interpreting this? Okay, I think basically swapping them... Okay, 14-inch guns in triple turrets. So basically doing a like-for-like swap on the Lexingtons, except so they're now armed with 14-inch guns. And they're built as a counter to Renown and Repulse. So it'd be a building 2, and the last 4 hulls are finished as either fast oilers or fleet carriers. Okay, that would be interesting. In some ways, that'd be similar to the question I answered earlier about the New Mexico-derived battle cruisers. So sort of the comments that I made about those would be as applicable, if not more so, to 14-inch gun Lexingtons, because they'd already have the speed, so you wouldn't even need to uprate the speed. You'd just, replace the machinery so that they can use a more compact machinery space to allow them to, in World War II, to be upgraded to have more anti-aircraft firepower. You're probably not really going to uprate their armour all that much, except for maybe uprating their deck armour to withstand against bombs, so you'd... they would be carrier escorts par excellence. The US Navy would be very, very much less scared of the Congos if they had 2 or 4 Lexingtons charging around, especially with a multiplicity of 14-inch guns. So yeah, I think that's what I can interpret from the question. A couple of Lexington-derived fast fleet oilers would be quite amusing, actually. Definitely keeping up with the fleet, and a lot of oil on them. Michael McLeod, if there was a video game where a player on board a warship could use time travel to visit 5 or 6 pivotal moments across that ship's career, apart from the Kamchatka, does any ship stand out to you as a good candidate? I mean, Enterprise, 5 or 6 pivotal moments, basically Enterprise, that would basically just be revisiting the various battles it fought. Warspite, of course, because that allows you to visit World War I and World War II. New Jersey would allow you to visit World War II, Korea, not Vietnam, but the 1980s. If you're looking for, I'd be tempted to say Goeben just purely on her sheer longevity, but outside of World War One, she doesn't do all that much. I mean, Victory, some of the other first rates and Brazes and large frigates would have obviously had a very long career. You'd be able to visit lots of different battles for them. So yeah, I think that those would be my main candidates, because most of the other long-lived ships tended to have their moments of glory in a single war, or maybe two. And if you want 5 or 6 moments, that's going to be asking for it a little bit. Or else you get long-lived ships that really only have one point of pivot, and then that's it. Unfortunately. Sherman 117. How would the night battle of Guadalcanal go if the US battleships there... If the US battleships were there during the night part of Jutland during World War One and learnt the same lessons as the UK. Well, there's two elements to the night battle of Guadalcanal. I mean, if we're talking about the second night, Washington-Kirishima, which is the only one where US battleships are present. If we're talking about them being present during Jutland in World War II, so the older coal-firing US battleships, so that presupposes Washington and South Dakota being replaced by a couple of, well, probably at that point Texas and New York, and they're somehow there. Presumably someone stuck radar on them. I mean, the problem is if they've the night in there. I suppose if the US Navy's... Okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying to disentangle the question slightly because it is a little bit jumbled. Maybe it's just my mind at the end of a long day. I think what you are asking is how would it go if the US, if there were US battleships present during the night action of Jutland, not necessarily the same ones are present at the battle at the night action of Guadalcanal. And so because the US battleships are present at the night action of Jutland, the US Navy has learned that night fighting is a serious thing the same way as the UK learned that night fighting was a serious thing at Jutland, i.e. the night battle, which we're talking about, San Francisco, Atlanta, etc., against Hiei and Kirishima, except that the US now has a viable working night battle doctrine. Right, I think that's what you mean. If you don't, then I apologise, but that's what I've interpreted it as. And if so, then... I mean, I've kind of answered this a few times before when I've spoken about how I would do it, or how I think maybe Admiral Scott would have done it. But the main way I can see it changing would basically be two things. Well, no. There'd be three things. One, there'd be a clear plan of action beforehand as to what they were supposed to be doing, rather than somewhat unclear orders that get countermanded and then given and countermanded again very quickly. Second, instead of proceeding in a line, you'd either be proceeding in chevrons or line abreast or several lines abreast, basically anything other than a conga line. And third, well, I mean, to be honest, even those two would probably be the two biggest changes. At which point, you know, if everyone's spread out in a line or chevrons, then the more modern and advanced radars that are present will get contacts off the Japanese fleet. Everyone's in roughly more of a line abreast formation, even if it's not a straight line abreast, which means everyone gets into contact at roughly the same time, knowing where the enemy is, which means that also having pre-worked tactics, they probably then open up with torpedoes at maximum range because the enemy's closing down, so they're going to come closer into torpedo range, and then hold their fire until either the Japanese start firing or the torpedoes start exploding, which means that at least the front frontal elements of the Japanese force are the ones that get chewed up very quickly. Now, it might then devolve into a bit of a melee as the Japanese battleships and the rear elements of the Japanese force come in, but you'll already have taken out a good chunk of the Japanese ships, and you'll have the upper hand. So, even if fighting Hiei and Kirishima with cruisers and destroyers may not quite go your way, the overall balance of forces lost will still probably be significantly in your favour, and with a better idea of how to night fight, you could certainly still get the mobbing of Hiei off, because they managed that in any way, and you may get Kirishima. I think that would depend on who's got torpedoes left and can they get into a launch position. Maxwell Looney asks, shipbuilders from the modern day General Dynamics, Bath Ironworks and Ingalls shipbuilding get sent back to 1925 America. With their knowledge, how indestructible of a ship can they create, especially that they now know how to make STS steel? STS was known for a fair bit of time before World War II, but see, the problem is that I wouldn't necessarily say how indestructible a ship they could make, because yeah, we have modern steels that are maybe better than STS in certain terms, like the steels that are used in submarine pressure hulls and so forth. But in terms of, armor grade steel, we don't make armor grade steel in the ways that they, in the manner that they made face hardened, 13.5-inch thick battleship armor plate back then. So actually the knowledge that they could offer in the steel making to create ships that were tougher would actually be relatively limited. They could maybe show them how to make slightly tougher than STS plating for general construction purposes, and if any one of those stuff has a bit of a historical bent, they could maybe point the US Navy towards some of the key trace elements that would allow them to uprate the durability of their main battleship plate a little bit, the way that the British and the Germans did with things like molybdenum. But in terms of making a ship indestructible, their metallurgical knowledge is probably not going to be that useful. Modern shipbuilders, if anything, would be useful in terms of their historical knowledge, to correct things that historically had to be evidenced by taking damage in the first place, like Nevada and the multiplicity of piercings in her bulkheads, or Lexington and her demise by fire, those kinds of things, and maybe some modern hull design ideas, subdivision, that kind of stuff. But I think you'd be surprised, given the durability of ships that were designed into war, at least the capital ships and so forth, outside of a few minor issues that are more to do with placement of things like fuel tanks and so forth. There'd actually be a surprisingly little that a modern shipbuilding text, I think, could offer in terms of making the ships even more indestructible from a metallurgical perspective. If anything, actually late 40s shipbuilding text sent back to 25 might be able to offer more practical knowledge on that score. The modern stuff, as I say, will be more about internals and history. The Crazy One asks, any chance of you sneaking off to Texas anytime soon? And are you jealous that Sabaton got to tour the ship in Drydock? Yes, of course I'm jealous of anyone apart from the Battleship Texas Foundation who gets to see Texas in Drydock before me. But on the other hand, the longer it is before I get to see the ship in Drydock, perhaps the more advanced work that will be done and that therefore I will get to see. As far as any chance of me sneaking off to Texas anytime soon, if by soon you mean this year, probably not. If by soon you mean early next year, then maybe. It just depends on how things how I can arrange things. And then hopefully I can see Texas in Drydock. Ray W says, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. Jason Roth asks, how does the Second World War change if all of the Axis powers have completed all of their respective fleet expansion projects from 1920 to 1945 with enough fuel and spare parts to run the ships for 10 years? Well, I mean, if they get it and the Allies don't get a response, then it makes a huge change, because if the Italians have completed Roma and Impero and the follow-on ships they had planned there, and the Germans have somehow, well, by 1940, if they're talking about up to 45, somehow completed a good chunk of the Z plan, then certainly in terms of modern ships, they completely outnumber and outgun the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale, and even in terms of ships total, they probably outnumber the Royal Navy in certain key aspects. And if the Japanese have, at that point, well, they've built 4 Yamatos, at least two super Yamatos, couple of dozen more carriers, including some pretty monstrous armoured carriers that are kind of rivaling the Midways. Yeah, then there's some serious problems there. The Royal Navy would basically be on a defensive back foot, and if most of the Z plan is there, they'd have to basically choose, do we defend the Mediterranean or not? And I think they'd probably have to give up the Mediterranean or just try and hold Alexandria and Gibraltar, and probably even that not very successfully, because the rest of the fleet's going to be needed at home to try and somehow stem the Z plan tide. The only one of the Allies who's potentially coming out of this in some way, shape or form with a winnable war in the short term is the States, because although they can't hope to challenge the IJN Doom fleet in 1941-42, they still have the advantage that, as doomy as the IJN fleet might be, it's still not going to be landing troops to occupy Pearl Harbor. It's still not going to be threatening the US West Coast, so they can just go, okay, that's fun, that's fine. You go and be a Doom fleet in the Western Pacific, and we'll sit back on the western US coast and in Pearl Harbor just building up our own Doom fleet to match, because Japanese industry is going to be hard enough pressed to support their new Doom fleet, let alone adding to it. William Potts saying thank you for answering the super chat. Thank you very much. Fleet of Oceans asks, the Battle of the Straits of Dover in 1890 is ongoing. The French, Russians and British are involved in a general melee. The French Admiral is aboard Hoche, the British Admiral on Royal Sovereign, and Russian Grand Admiral Zinovy Rozhesvensky has somehow time-travelled his rank. But anyway, they all look to both sides of the channel and see near on 20 Martian tripods approaching, 10 from either shore. Assuming the combined fleet ceases hostilities and turns on the invaders, how stuffed are the Martians given the number of capital ship presence and the various binoculars Rozhesvensky is throwing at them? The tripods, I think, assuming that not too many capital ship losses have happened at that point, the tripods are probably pretty stuffed, because although it's all kind of action off screen that we don't see, we are told in War of the Worlds that what is effectively amounts to the Channel Fleet goes in after the tripods, and from the sounds of it engages them for most of the night in battle. Now, we don't know or see what happens in the aftermath, but we don't hear about tripods reaching across from the south coast, which is where they pretty much had reached at that point, to France. So at best or worst, depending on whose side you're on, maybe it was a mutual kill. Maybe the Channel Fleet won with heavy losses. Maybe they got wiped out, but they weakened the tripods enough they thought better of going into the water. Who knows? But it seems that massed ironclads and pre-dreadnoughts are capable of stopping tripods. I mean, Thunderchild was evidence enough of that. So, yeah, if you have the entire French, Russian and British fleet minus a few losses turn on 20 tripods, then, yeah, I think the tripods go down. They'll inflict losses, but they will take out the tripods. John Hart asks, 2 years ago I asked about a fictitious battle in 1894 between the Royal Navy and Russia and France. Did you ever get a panoramic scene of the battle commissioned? I got part way through getting it commissioned, but as far as I can recall, I think the artist in question that I had lined up wasn't able to continue with it for whatever reason. That's to my recollection anyway. I could be wrong because it was a while ago. So no, unfortunately the final panoramic didn't get done. But if there's anyone out there who's decent at naval artwork and, wants to give it a shot, again, drop me a line and I can try and pick things up again. Because I definitely do want to get it done. It's just, with between lockdown and all the other stuff I've had to be doing, it has kind of slipped between the cracks after the first effort to get it done failed. We are catching up with the super chat, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 left at the moment. And then it's into the general chat. All my wonderful KFC and chips have all gone horribly cold. Oh well, I can at least try and reheat them. The chips are definitely getting reheated in the air fryer. They're really nice chips when they're warm, but no one likes cold chips. Redacted asks, if the Second London Treaty ends with no treaty at all and the collapse of the treaty system due to the Japanese, what does World War II look like? I mean, it's not going to look that different because the Japanese were going off and doing their own thing anyway. Second London, I mean, there's time for the Italians to maybe think about redoing Roma and Impero to bigger, but they probably won't. The Germans, I mean, Bismarck and Sirpitz are already well outside of treaty limits, so, that's not really going to change all that much. What might well change, if Second London just ends with no agreement, there might be time to reconfigure the King George V's to something like 1515s, or even maybe rework them to proto-Lions, the way that North Carolina had her guns swapped out. Because normally it's said, the King George V were too far along, which is true, but that is with Second London still holding. If Second London is very clearly doomed during the negotiations and nothing ever gets signed, then they might be able to pull off Proto-Line. And, well, I mean, the British and the Americans will start their rearmament building a little bit sooner. The Crown colonies, for example, will probably be at least regular towns, if not Belfast, Edinburgh style, because they don't need to be reduced down in tonnage to comply with Second London. DM Carpenter saying KFC, not Bojangles house ad. Yeah, unfortunately, there's no Bojangles in southwest London. Valiant Nemes asks, are you concerned by the fact that only 1 in every 100k subs are here in the chat? Not particularly. I mean, this is the second chat we've done in a week, and I only put it up as going live in like 4 hours ago. So, and also Sunday afternoon dash evening is not the usual time I do them. So, there's 375 of you, so that's perfectly fine. As long as I'm chatting to a decent number of people, I don't mind on the exact numbers. And who knows, with 375 people, there might actually be a chance for me to vaguely try and keep up with chat questions instead of just watching huge blocks of text scroll by. But yeah, anyway, sorry. So if Second London ends with no treaty, the single biggest change I can see is maybe a regunning of the King George V design, but the more likely changes are going to be in there be more and larger cruisers being built slightly earlier, and more and larger destroyers as well, because they've just got a little bit of extra time. Sol asks, how would the Punic Wars have gone if Rome never lost a fleet to storms? Better for the Romans, obviously. But the Romans kind of dominated most of the Punic War naval engagements when they weren't, being run from behind by someone who thought it was a bunch of soldiers on drill. So if Rome never loses the fleet to storms, then they dominate the naval aspect of it even more. But that's not going to stop Hannibal, because, of course, by the time of Hannibal, the Carthaginians knew they couldn't win a naval war with Rome, and that's one of the reasons why Hannibal went the long way round via what's now Spain and then France and then into Italy. So, of course, there's the possibility that if Carthage had received so many short, sharp defeats at sea so quickly during the earlier Punic War, well, one of the earlier Punic Wars, then maybe they would have been defeated heavily enough that although Hannibal might have wanted to take vengeance, maybe he wouldn't have been able to rally as many troops as he did. So who knows? But yeah, I mean, Rome not losing fleets to storms in the Punic Wars is basically just kind of they win harder in that war. Would you? And then another question: would you be open to doing a collab with Rex's Hangar at some point? I don't see why not. I've not seen anything bad about the Rex's Hangar channel, and of the videos of his that I've watched, I haven't found anything particularly wrong with them. So yeah, I'd be perfectly happy to work with him. Jeffrey Papiers asks, the 6 big US frigates are sent back to 1588 as an escort force for the Spanish Armada. How much could their presence change the outcome, assuming the crews have future knowledge of the upcoming battle? Very heavily. I mean, they're faster than basically anything that's present. They've got more firepower than anything that's present, and they can fire a lot faster than anything that's present. I think they're also probably overall bigger than almost anything that's present, certainly longer. So yeah, they could just hold off the English fleet and start knocking ships off one after another, and they know that the fire ships are coming, so they can forewarn everybody. I mean, they can make the English fleet suffer. The one thing I don't think they can do is make the Spanish Armada a success, purely because the Spanish Armada's success was predicated, one, on the wind, which they can't change, and is still going to blow the Armada up around Scotland, around Ireland, although with most of their anchor cabling intact, perhaps the Spanish Armada will take less losses to the weather, but that's still a very vicious storm to deal with. And the other thing is, the Spanish Armada, to be successful, needs the Duke of Parma's troops, and they're not ready, and there's nothing the presence of the 6 frigates can change about that either. Maybe that with fending off the fireship attack, they can persuade Medina Sidonia to just sit there and wait and wait and wait, but I don't think the Armada can afford to do that, personally. So yeah, they can make it in terms of combat, the kind of a Spanish Armada wins the fighting, but strategically I don't think those big frigates can change the fact that Parma's troops just aren't ready. And then Blue Jacket Warrior, in one of your videos on the Battle of Denmark Strait, you mentioned that Prince Eugen heard torpedoes coming on her hydrophones. I've heard of light cruisers getting sonar, but never heavy cruisers. Can you expand? So the Germans were quite fanatical about sticking hydrophones when they had once they had them developed. They stuck hydrophones on an awful lot of their stuff, including Prince Eugen. But you've also got to remember that there is a difference between sonar and hydrophones. So I know these days hydrophones and their successor technologies we call passive sonar, and then you have active sonar that goes ping. But back in World War II, hydrophones and ASDIC or sonar, depending on which nation you belong to, were very different technologies, and hydrophones were a lot more common than active sonar was, because active sonar was something that had been developed during the interwar period, but was still, gradually being fitted to various ships in the fleet, whereas hydrophones had been around actually in World War One as a relatively mature technology. The R-class, for example, and that's not the R-class, the battleships, the R-class submarines of World War One are kind of the proto-hunter-killers, and they obviously didn't use a non-existent active sonar. They used a massive hydrophone array to try and home in on enemy subs. So, yeah, Prince Eugen having hydrophones is entirely plausible, just as a thing, apart from the fact that the German records very specifically state they had hydrophones and they heard things. So, yeah. And also, obviously, different national priorities. If your entire fleet of heavy cruisers consists of, 6 ships, Hipper, Prince Eugen, Blücher, Scheer, Graf Spee and Deutschland, then, you can deploy hydrophones on your entire heavy cruiser fleet a lot easier than the British or the Americans could, because you have so many more to install things on. The crazy one asks, Admiral Yee versus Admiral Nelson, who's your money on? I mean, in a straight-up fight at sea, Nelson, but that's largely because he's got a couple of 100 years technological advantage over Yee. Admiral Yee is a special... I mean, by circumstance, he is a specialist at fighting hugely outnumbered, but with a technological edge, which is also what Nelson is a specialist at. But Yee is a specialist at, again, mostly by circumstance, forcing your enemy to fight in close confined straits and narrows, basically a coastal defense admiral, because the Japanese are coming to him. Nelson is more used to deep ocean fighting, although obviously with Copenhagen and such, he's somewhat used to coastal fighting as well, and Nile and so forth. So if you assume that both sides have equal knowledge about the technology and they are fighting using similar technology vessels, if Admiral Nelson is in command, I'd give money on Nelson out at sea, and I'd put money on Admiral Yee if it's a coastal engagement. And then the last super chat so far by Miles Bacaskill is, anything remotely equivalent to Vic Fontaine from DS9 on a warship in the time period the channel covers? Did any warships have piano bars, and if not, onshore to base perhaps? A surprising number of warships did have things like upright pianos. They didn't carry full-time entertainers the way that Vic Fontaine, the hologram, is in DS9. But yeah, you'd be like, even destroyers I've read accounts of in World War One and World War Two, especially more in World War Two when they're a bit bigger. I've read accounts of destroyers having an upright piano in a wardroom somewhere. Bigger ships had ship's bands and so forth. And so, if there was a crew member on board who happened to also have instrumentation or singing skills, then there would be regular entertainments for the crew. But that was more a case of, we have the instruments and we have some crew who are good at this, rather than, having a specific entertainer aboard. Well, hang on a sec, 2 seconds, just mute myself. Sorry, just getting some liquid refreshment and grabbing a couple of bits of chicken. And in the interim, another chat comes in. So Redacted asks, if Samuel B. Roberts and Johnson managed to get their torpedoes into Yamato during the Battle of Samar, how does this change things? Depends where they hit. If they hit Yamato in an area which causes damage but doesn't necessarily slow it down all that much, it might spook Yamato into running slightly sooner. But apart from maybe ensuring that Gambier Bay isn't lost, it's probably not going to change all that much. But if they manage to hit Yamato in such a way that it causes major flooding forward, or cripples a propeller, or jams a rudder, or in some way slows it down, then that changes things hugely. Because if Yamato is slowed down, then you can guarantee the various escort carrier air attacks are going to concentrate on her. And while I don't necessarily think the various Taffy's air attacks would be concentrated or heavy enough to sink Yamato the way that 5 fleet carriers could, what they would do is keep Yamato down and keep her slowed long enough, because at this point, remember, Task Force 34 under Admiral Lee is coming steaming back at full force. So a lucky hit might slow the Yamato down long enough for Admiral Lee to come in and finish it off in glorious gun combat. The crazy one says, have you seen any of the Fat Electricians naval episodes, and what do you think? I might have seen one. I certainly haven't seen many. Sherman 117 says, as a punishment for not believing in Beatty, you must fix Bairn so she can become a decent carrier. Oh boy, that's a punishment and a half. How do you fix Bairn? Okay, if I'm going to have to fix Bairn to make her a decently useful carrier, then I'm going to have to Italianize her. So instead of just going, here's a Normandy-class battleship, we are putting a carrier hull on top, superstructure on top. You have to take her, well, when she's still in the dock, basically cut a section out, elongate her, put some additional machinery in there to ramp up the power, and between the additional machinery and the additional length, that hopefully should at least push her into the 25 knot range, if not faster, and will also mean a longer flight deck and a bigger hangar, at which point you have created more useful Bairn. That would be the easiest way for me to do it. Trains King asks, you've stated many times previously that your favourite Royal Navy battleships are Warspite, Hood and Vanguard. This time, however, I'm going to limit you to only the 12 and 13.5 inch battleships and battlecruisers. What's your favourite variant of each? Okay, so that basically is 4. Iron Duke, 13.5 inch battleship favourite. The choice between Tiger and Queen Mary for 13.5 inch battlecruiser, though. I mean, I know most people think conventionally Tiger looks nicer, and yeah, in some ways maybe. And I know that tactically speaking, Tiger's gun layout makes a lot more sense. But there is something about Q turret on Queen Mary. It's less practical. And of course, Queen Mary is a slightly earlier ship and less advanced. But there's something very World War I about an amidships Q turret. Yeah, I don't know which of the 2 battle cruisers I'd pick as my favourite. If you go down to the 12 inch, if I have to pick a 12 inch battle cruiser, then I'd go with New Zealand purely because of its combat career. And if I'm going to pick a 12-inch battleship, again, assuming from the question I'm going with the Royal Navy, I really don't like Colossus, Hercules, and Neptune. It would be a toss-up between either St. Vincent as the ultimate end goal of the original Dreadnought design style, or Dreadnought itself. I mean, they're basically the same layout, although St. Vincent has a meaningful secondary battery for the time. But then you've got Dreadnought, and Dreadnought is Dreadnought. So I think I'd have to go for Dreadnought. USS Grey Ghost asks, so now we're finally done with the super chats, I think. Oh no, one more, but I'm gonna answer a chat question quickly before I go on to the next super chat. So Ramal asks, what if the Alaskas had a slightly wider and longer hull and carried improved 14 or Iowa 16-inch guns? Would they be categorized as battle cruisers? Armor and secondaries are all the same. Yes, if they're carrying twin 16s with the armor and secondaries, etc., as the same as the Alaskas, they're definitely battle cruisers. Same with the 14-inch, because at that point it's battleship grade guns, cruiser grade armor. They're basically the Invincibles, except for the modern era. And Grey Ghost asks, would the flak U-boat concept have worked if the Germans had Mark 53 style shells? And how fast could a submerged World War II sub have been if it had been built with a teardrop shaped outer hull? In regard to the flak U-boat concept, well, the flak U-boat concept was a nasty surprise, so you could say it worked initially. As for could the concept have worked generally, not really, because the flak U-boats, they could be very vicious, but the problem with the flak U-boat is that an aircraft, even a big 4-engine patrol aircraft, is a lot cheaper than a U-boat, and you can hit a patrol plane, whether that be a seaplane or whatever, with a few anti-aircraft shells before it's likely to go down. You know, it can limp away another day if you shoot an engine out or something. Whereas the U-boat itself, if you put one hole in the pressure hull, it's at best mission aborted. At worst, that's it. So long, so farewell, auf Wiedersehen, and good night. So it would have been more costly, but the flak U-boat concept overall was against the Allied, against the strength of aircraft the Allied could present, would have been a long-term hiding to nothing. Then we've got, so these are the ones that have come in. Stephen Meyer. Okay, so this I think is a clarification about the Lexingtons. I was asking more for how effective would they be and what effects would they have on situations going forward. Would the North Carolinas be in the Pacific sooner, and what would the other parties of treaties do in response? So this is in response to the 14-inch Lexingtons. Okay, so if you've got 14-inch 34,000 ton, oh no, not 34,000 ton, that was the New Mexico ones. If you've got 14-inch Lexingtons, multiple, then you're either going to have to have the overall displacement limit of ships in the Washington Treaty raised, or you're going to have to carve out a really big exception clause for however many Lexingtons are going to be built, which everyone else is. So you're going to have, instead of Hood being the sort of the one no one talks about, you're basically going to have everyone with their normal ships, and then the British are going to be looking at, you know, either building a slightly downrated, or possibly not downrated at all, G3 set to match the number. So if you build 4 Lexingtons, they'll be like, okay, well, we get 3 G3s plus Hood, or something like that, the Japanese will almost certainly demand at least a couple of Amagis, etc. Because if you've got 14-inch guns or 16-inch, if you've got 3-4 plus Lexingtons at that size and displacement, that you can't ignore that for the purposes of the treaty. People are going to want to have some kind of counter. In terms of effectiveness, well, it'll be similar to, assuming they made no other design changes, my standing criticism of the Lexingtons of having World War One era armour in a post-World War One era world where 15 and 16-inch shells are getting thrown around, kind of, I think, remains. Albeit that in the treaty world, as opposed to the world the Lexingtons were being built for, the 11-inch armour at least provides some protection against... Oh, no, 11-inch is incomparable. Nope, scrap that. Okay. I mean, the Congos get away with light armour, so I think, at that point, they'd still make very good carrier escorts. Overall, the effect for the US might be negative because of that under-armouring. If the Japanese and the British are able to get G3s and Amagis out of it as a counter, then they're going to have issues, because then the Lexingtons will be the weakest of those built, except for the fact they make excellent carrier escorts, and possibly, as a kind of with the New Mexico battlecruiser question, they would be prime candidates to actually get modernized in the mid to late 1930s, which would probably mean brand new machinery. And so I can only imagine someone, as well as putting a ton of AA, would have to try and uprate the armour somewhat, unless they want to just accept the armour as it is and basically use them as extremely oversized Alaska style, Congo Hunter dash carrier escorts. Would the North Carolinas be in the Pacific sooner? I think if anything they'd be in the Pacific later, because the main thing North Carolina and Washington did initially, outside of Lee's excursion into Guadalcanal, which he could still do on a Lexington, bear in mind that Washington wasn't hit, so the armour wouldn't really make much odds. If the Lexingtons are available, modernised or partially modernised, for running carrier escort in the Pacific, there's less of a pressure for the North Carolinas to be sent there ASAP, so they'd probably spend more time in the Atlantic trying to work out their propeller vibration issues and helping out the British. They'd eventually end up there, but unless one or more of the Lexingtons was sunk, there'd be less pressure to urgently deploy brand new ships to the area. And as far as situations going forward, I mean, it's obviously the London treaties would be affected by that, because everyone would then be looking at this whole tranche of 40 in the 40s of thousands of tons displacement battle cruisers, going, well, we've got to design ships to counter them. So I think the 14-inch, at that point, the 14-inch proposal by the British at Second London would be dead on arrival, because even if the Lexingtons have 14-inch guns, the 16 inches on what would now be the Nagatos and the Amagis, and on the British's own G3s, no one's going to buy dropping back to 14-inch with so many 16-inch ships out there. What's that? Redacted. Oh, Redacted says this is Samuel B. Robertson Johnson. If they manage to get their torpedoes into Yamato, he meant if they cause a primary magazine detonation. How that changed? Well, it changes things quite dramatically. Yamato's gone. apart from picking up survivors, I mean, Kurita will be gone with it. So at that point, the rest of the Japanese forces are just going to turn and leave. Because, well, they've lost their admiral, they've lost their flagship, and there's no way they're going to believe a couple of little dinky escorts have managed to pull that off. They're going to be convinced there's some kind of super weapon in play. Todd Webb pointing out no love for Agincourt. Well, 12-inch gunships. I mean, Agincourt's kind of a bought-in ship. I really like Agincourt, but if I'm being asked about British ships, let's face it, we kind of nicked it off the Ottomans, and it was Brazilian before that. So if you ask me about 12-inch ships, generally Agincourt would be high up on my list, but I think it's a bit unfair to stick her in a competition with the British 12-inch gunships, apart from anything else, because she'd basically win. So certainly, yeah, if you put me in a room, Colossus, Hercules, Neptune or Agincourt, it's not exactly a very difficult decision there, is it? Thank you, Alan M. The crazy one asks, would a modern battleship equipped with 16-inch railguns and lots of land attack missiles be plausible? Again, this is treading on the era of modern stuff, which I don't cover on the channel, but theoretically, you've got to get the railguns working at that scale first. Jesse Estrada asks, why does 1 to 2 knots of speed matter so much when it's barely noticeable? A 1 to 2 knot speed advantage usually in a tactical situation doesn't matter too much. But where it can matter is in an overall strategic situation. Partly, and also in a fleet situation. Partly because if you're a couple of knots faster, that usually suggests that you can cruise a couple of knots quicker at efficient fuel burning speeds, which means your overall over time strategic maneuverability is greater. Plus, in a flat out battle line race, if you've got a couple of knots advantage starting out, then that gives you a little bit of option. Basically means you're not going to lose a strategic position. You may not be able to gain it with only 1 or 2 knots, but you're not going to lose one or allow your enemy to exploit things too much. The other thing is when in a battle line situation, if you have some ships that are a couple of knots faster than others, you can get very strung out. Because in theory, again going back to Jutland, in theory, even if the Deutschlands are a little bit wider of the mark, although they're supposed to be pretty quick. Let me just double check their speeds. Just want to make sure. So the Deutschland-class battleships, so ostensibly the Deutschland-class on a good day could make 19 knots. The Nassaus theoretically are 19, maybe 20 knots, and the Helgolands are 20 knots, whereas the Kaiser and Koenigs are 21. So actually, there's a theoretical speed spread of 1 to 2 knots across the high seas fleet. But then you look at how strung out the high seas fleet gets. By the time it runs into the Grand Fleet, the Nassaus, Helgolands, and Deutschlands are actually now, by the time the battle engages, actually considerably behind. So 1 to 2 knots in a 1v1 might not make too much of a difference, but on a fleet scale, it actually does make quite a difference. Hello, Dr. Clark. He has arrived. It's okay, we're just about hitting 3 hours. Excuse me. I do need to have some food, so I'm going to get through hopefully a reasonable amount of your chat, regular in-chat questions, but say I am very hungry and all my food's already cold. Sean Riley, could you go into detail on the conversion of USS Kearsarge BB5 into a crane ship? I have a feeling I've mentioned this in a 5-minute guide. I can't really go into detail in a live dry dock because there are lots of little details I need to pick up on it. But I definitely can, I think, excuse me. The Kearsarge, I think, if I haven't already done a 5-minute guide, is definitely on the list to get her own 5-minute guide to go into it in more details. CCP, have you ever visited the Gneisenau turret in Norway? And if not, do you have any plans to do so? I haven't. I've never been to Norway, but I do have plans to do so. I want to visit Oscarborg Fortress as well, and a couple of other things in Norway. So that is on the list of things to do. This is a duck asks, what time is it for you at the moment? It is just after 11 o'clock at night. We started at 8. Vicky McDonough asks, how does a torpedo explosion go far enough into a capital ship's hull to detonate the main magazines, such as with Pommern or Wasp? So there's a few methods. Firstly, a torpedo is a multi-ton object travelling at, depending on the war, upwards of 35 to 40 miles an hour, if not more. So, and it's a lot more compact and solid an object than a car. So it's actually got a degree of penetration itself, bearing in mind it's hitting the hull, usually the hull, not the armour belt. So it can physically penetrate part of the ship's hull. Now, granted, it's probably not going to go very far, with all that being said, especially with a torpedo defence system. But, notably, you cite Pommern and Wasp, neither of which had much in the way, if anything, of torpedo defence. So, at that point, a speeding torpedo could get significantly deeper into the hull. Then you've got the explosion itself of the warhead and the fragments of hot metal that results from that, both from the torpedo itself and from the hull around it, the bulkheads and stuff that have suddenly been turned into shrapnel. Excuse me, I must have swallowed some drink a bit wrong. Right, so on these ships with relatively minimal torpedo protection, you're actually going to have relatively little, assuming the explosion itself doesn't reach the magazines, which even on a ship with a fair degree of torpedo protection like North Carolina almost happened. You're going to have, as I say, these hot pieces of shrapnel, and the key thing is that those hot pieces of shrapnel, if they get into the magazines, which again this far down probably don't have all that much in the way of armor protection, they are going to not just be extremely hot, capable of setting off the charges, but a lot of the protective measures, whether they be leather cases or metal cases of the charges in the magazines, a fast-moving piece of shrapnel from a torpedo explosion can punch straight into, thus negating the protective value of the cases. And usually all it takes is 1 or 2 charges to start going off, and then everything else cooks off, and that's it. Knight6831 asks, why has the lesson that you must keep going despite losing a beloved ship be forgotten? Looking back, the British had to pick themselves back up after they lost Hood and to keep fighting to make sure the ship's loss was not in vain. I think it's a combination of fleets being smaller and people becoming more and more casualty averse, basically. Which, ironically enough, can serve to create more casualties because it gives the opponent a chance to turn around and exploit the first casualty for even more benefit. Redstone Builder, I heard that Texas and or the refitted Nevada participated in the hunt for Bismarck. Is this true, and if so, how would they have fared? Nevada didn't, because the hunt for Bismarck occurred before Pearl Harbor, so it definitely wasn't refit Nevada, and Nevada was in the Pacific Fleet. Texas was in the Atlantic at the time. She didn't get close enough. She got closer than some Royal Navy battleships that are credited with taking part, but she wasn't an active part of the hunt because ostensibly at that point the US is still neutral. So she was there, she was in the Atlantic, she was aware of the situation, Sorry, there's a moth floating around. I want to kill it before it gets into the photographs. But against Bismarck, I mean, she is on a little bit of the short stick. She's got, compared to Bismarck, she's got outdated fire control equipment. Her armour's not really going to protect her from Bismarck's 15-inch shells, and she can't run away. The flip side is, 10, 14-inch guns will still hurt if they land a shot. And it's a question of, that's the big question, would they land shots? So basically, Texas against Bismarck. Texas is at a disadvantage. It is Bismarck's fight to lose. But, similar to, if Bismarck had run into an R-class or a QE, their guns are still capable of hurting Bismarck if Bismarck gets close enough. So, you can always have an upset. Grey Ghost asking, have I got to the water tank tests for my Hood theory? Not yet. Still working with the university. It's just, these things take time, and all the more so in a post-COVID environment where, a bunch of the admin staff were let go and don't seem to have come back. Aluminium fence. How come seaplane tenders or blimps were not used to close the GI UK gap? Weather, basically. Visibility, both from icy fog and from storms and stuff in the GI UK gap, was and continues to be fairly awful quite a lot of the time. So blimps, sure, on a nice sunny day would work, but the number of nice sunny days is very, very limited. And seaplane tenders, whilst, maybe some seaplane tenders based out of Iceland or something would help with the air patrols. Again, if you have freezing fog and really bad weather as a regular event, that's going to disrupt those seaplanes' ability to patrol. Whereas cruisers, for the most part, especially if they're radar-equipped cruisers, can keep going through all of that. And also bear in mind, night is a form of weather as well, which again, a radar-equipped cruiser can see through, especially in like 1940-41, a seaplane or a blimp is more concerned with just keeping itself alive in that weather than anything else. Aluminium fence says you look a little red. It may be the lighting, it may be maybe having been at Tiger Day, I may have spent several hours in the sun. I don't burn, so I suspect it's more the light, or maybe I'm coming through with a late winter tan. Who knows? Croydon fried chicken? No. Epsom fried chicken, maybe. When I worked at Croydon, I ate semi-regularly at the Croydon KFC. Let's just say it was a bit of a hit or miss experience. There's a reason I transitioned over to the Croydon Five Guys in my last year of employment there before lockdown and everything. The only slightly irritating thing is that Croydon remains the closest Five Guys, which is irritating to me generally, but my waistline is probably grateful for that. Captain Jack 1138, is there even an inkling of naming another ship Hood? Probably not for a while. I would give it at least another generation. Just keep an eye out for that moth. Calvin Green 90, would BM-13 Katyushka rockets with VT fusing be an effective anti-aircraft mount in World War II? A one-shot, maybe. Compared to the UP rocket launchers, there's not as many of them, and I mean, obviously, UP rocket launchers, Katyushka rockets, they're all very vulnerable. But yeah, in theory, VT-fused heavy rockets with a large shrapnel shell would be at least an effective anti-kamikaze mount. General anti-air, probably not so much, but definitely effective anti-kamikaze. Niels Larsen asks, in your ship list you include Niels Jules, but which one is it? And do you have what is your opinion on Dandarius from Valkyria Chronicles 2? My opinion on anything from Valkyria Chronicles 2 is that I am aware that Valkyria Chronicles 2 exists. That is about as far as my knowledge of Valkyria Chronicles goes. But for the question about Niels Jules, that's in reference to the coast defense ship then built in the 1910s. Mark Bass says the US Navy 16-inch super heavy shells have written on the side not to use a full powder charge or something to that effect. What would happen if you started firing super heavy shells with a full charge? I'm pretty sure you can use the super heavy shells with a full charge. Let me go through some of my photos from the US trip, because I do shockingly have a bunch of photos on there that include the 16-inch shells. I'd be very surprised if they said something like that. Let's have a look. Shell. That one doesn't say anything. Well, it doesn't say anything in the angle that I got of it anyway. That's all the engine room. Maybe I have to look in Massachusetts. Massachusetts. Oh, I recorded some video of Massachusetts. That's going to be handy. Sorry, I'm going through so many... Oh, there's a shell or two. Wow, that's one. What does that say? No, that's just the weight. That one says hoist. That's incredibly unhelpful. It may be training shells that maybe have don't use full charge on them. But I'll have to look into it to be 100% sure. But I would be fairly sure that that I think maybe training shells might have do not use full powder charge on them. That which I can definitely understand, considering that they're training shells and much lighter weight. But yeah, I will double check when I go through, because otherwise I'm just going to be here going through like 50 billion photos from the US trip. Okay, so we've reached 1/4 so I'll wrap it up at 1/2. That seems fair. So wasn't there something about that with Iowa's Turret 2? Now, Iowa's Turret 2 was to do with the charge, that one or more charges exploding. The USS Iowa Museum Ship Channel, that is, they have a video going over the Turret 2 explosion. So I would direct you there to get more detail about that. Daniel asks, if Greek fire was technology that remained available to navies, how do you think it would have affected battles in the Age of Sail? That's quite a fun one, because on the one hand, naval captains are, especially in the Age of Sail, are historically absolutely categorically against bringing anything significantly liquid and flammable aboard their ships. So overcoming the resistance to that would be quite interesting. On the other hand, obviously, it is a very, very effective weapon. Although cannon outranges Greek fire by the time of the Age of Sail, I think you may still have seen, certainly in more confined waters where galleys and so forth remained viable, so basically close quarter combat would definitely still see Greek fire used. and you might see maybe a Greek fire projector or two up on the quarterdeck for use in close combat. The main problem you'd have, I think, with with persuading people to use Greek fire in the Age of Sail would be that the ships are obviously combustible and now full of gunpowder as well. So at a range where you were close enough to use it, it's very likely that A, the enemy might use it on you, and B, even if they don't have it, you've set fire to the enemy and now they're probably going to ram into you, and then you are now on fire as well. So it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, as opposed to when it was historically being used, when individual warships were a lot smaller, a lot more expendable, and could maneuver away a lot easier. It's a weird one to contemplate, but I think the use of Greek fire in the Age of Sail probably would have been restricted to very specific certain classes of ship, and obviously found its way into bombardment, things like bomb vessels. Calvin Green 90 says, could putting a short delay between the prematurely firing magnetic detonator and charge on Mark 14 torpedoes have been effective in getting sinking vessels? Potentially. The problem would be that, as with Harusame's hit from Wahoo, occasionally the thing worked. And so if you have a specific delay built in, then it means the occasional Mark 14 whose magnetic detonator does work now won't work, so you've still got a rate of failures. And once the depth running issue has been solved, you're then relying on the contact fuse, which, when I get round to the next part of the US sub campaign, which will probably be some point in January, you'll end up finding the contact fuse didn't work very well either. So yeah, they're without a systemic fixing, there really wasn't much you could do to significantly help the Mark 14 until kind of late 1943. 96831, is it right that the guns that Port Stanley had for coastal defence in World War II, if they'd been working, wouldn't have helped much when the Argentines invaded back in 1982? I don't know offhand. I'd have to check where their positions were, where their arcs of fire and ranges were, and where the initial Argentine invasion came in. And of course the fact that if the Argentines knew that the guns were still operational, would they have still come into those locations? That's not something I've looked into in huge amounts of detail in that particular combination of factors. Oh, the moth. Winged it. Stafford Thompson says, speaking of bombardment ships, could they launch Greek fire in a mortar shell like modern-day explosive rounds? Yes, they could have, because they were launching explosive shells. So in theory, you could have put Greek fire in there instead of gunpowder. Although, yeah, that would have been a bit of a health and safety nightmare. But then again, health and safety and Age of Sail bombardment vessels, not really some ships that pass in the night, to be honest. Steam Catapult asks, I've noticed most larger Royal Navy ships get a pennant number. Does this serve the same purpose as numbers such as CV6 or BB61? I've also noticed duplicates. How do pennants get passed down? They're not quite, unfortunately, they're not quite as organised as the US ones with CV6 and BB61. So if you know, there, obviously you can refer to this pennant number refers to that ship. But the Royal Navy pennant number system has undergone about 3 or 4 revisions during the 20th century. They even completely reorganised it during the Second World War, which really didn't help. So, you can see, for example, destroyers in the Second World War with pennant numbers beginning with G, and the same ship with a pennant number beginning with F, but with completely different numbers as well in the same conflict. So they are a way of classifying ships, and I think maybe these days, with so few ships in the Royal Navy, it's gotten a little bit more consistent. But they do keep reusing numbers just because they're not in use they're like, well, this makes sense to use this number now, and it's not in use on any other ship currently. So yeah, it's much more of a kind of a rolling system than the US one. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no great ceremony to them. Dad Jarvis says, "Well, liking the video, get your question answered faster. Only one way to find out." Unfortunately, I have no way of actually telling how many likes there are on this. Oh no, there's a like counter, but there's no way for me to telling if who's actually done the liking. So I'm basically just trying to pick questions. I'm trying to pick questions on two bases. One is that we've only got 7 minutes to go, so I'm trying to pick questions I can answer relatively swiftly. And secondly, I'm trying to pick questions from as many different people as possible. Because to be honest, in terms of good quality questions, I could do like an entire night, so that's just the Night 6831 show, and a few others of you here who, you constantly ask really good questions. But unfortunately, much as I'd like to answer them all, I can't answer them all on a live stream, otherwise no one else gets a look in. Oh dear. But no, take it to your credit that there's persistently good questions. A. Bush asks, if USS Missouri and the Iowa-class battleships generally were not yet commissioned, what ship do you think the 1945 surrender would have been signed aboard? Oh, that's a good one. It would have been either whichever ship was the official flagship, which at that point probably would have been South Dakota, because she was built with flagship facilities, or whichever Pearl Harbor survivor was in the vicinity that they could rope in. If they could get West Virginia in there, I think they probably would have used that if the Iowas hadn't been around. So yeah, Stafford Thompson, maybe, you never know, when I get my Greek fire system working. The Estoppel asks, what was your last great burrito? Weirdly enough, for someone who's half South American, although obviously burritos tend to be more Central American as far as I understand it, I think I've only ever had one burrito in my life, and it was from the Taco Bell in Croydon, which, in common with about half of Croydon restaurants, was just not a generally great experience. To be fair to Croydon, as I said, the Five Guys in Croydon is great. There was a really good Builders Cafe in Croydon. Absolutely no question, they were brilliant. But a lot of the chain restaurants in Croydon seem to be some of the worst examples. The Burger King in Croydon, oh my goodness, not only did they get your order wrong half the time, but you put the tray down on the table, and then it was an effort to unstick the tray from the table afterwards on some days. Grey Ghost asks about I think you mean Rodney being handled like a destroyer when she fought Bismarck. So that's Captain Dalrymple Hamilton. I've mentioned him a few times. Basically, he was a destroyer commander before he took command of Rodney. And obviously I can't go into detail in a live stream, but basically battleships conventionally sail in a line with very little manoeuvring to give themselves the best chance to get their guns on target, rather than manoeuvre, because, well, our battleship's not usually the most manoeuvrable thing anyway, whereas destroyers usually rely on their manoeuvrability to survive. But Dalrymple Hamilton seems to have either not got the memo about that or just ignored it completely, so he was doing what they call chasing the salvo. So when Bismarck fired, obviously every time you fire and you don't score a hit, you make adjustments to your guns to aim at the new point where you think your enemy will be, with adjustments made to elevation and bearing, etc., and then you fire again. So usually the one place you can guarantee is not going to be hit by the next salvo is the place the previous salvo landed. And Dalrymple Hamilton was basically using Rodney as a giant destroyer, just chasing after where each salvo had gone. So every time Bismarck fired a salvo, he's like, well, I'm in the place Bismarck roughly fired its last salvo at, so that's probably not going to be where they'll hit this time. And he was broadly correct. Rodney took a little bit of splinter damage from a near miss, but that was about it. Right, so we have a couple of minutes left. Mr. Serenity's End, what was the largest hurdle for a country in building its first dreadnought? That's a good one, actually. I was going to say industry, but then, to be honest, most of the country, in pretty much every country that built its own dreadnought already had extensive naval infrastructure from building pre-dreadnoughts. I'd say probably the largest hurdle faced by any country building its first dreadnought was probably Spain, in terms of just coming up with the money for it in the first place, for the Españas. Because they flat out did not have the industry to be able to build. Well, I mean, their last pre-dreadnought, Palaio, was a little bit old by that point. The Spanish shipbuilding industry for modern ships in the early 20th century basically didn't exist. And as I said, they didn't have a lot of money, so that they probably had the single biggest hurdles to come over to get their initial dreadnoughts constructed. Okay, so 2 more questions. DM Carpenter saying, I've never seen anything about firing Mark 8s with anything other than 6 powder bags. Yeah, I mean, there are reduced charges. They still need the volume of the 6 powder bags, because otherwise you get weird squirrely things happening with where the shell is. And gas expansion. There are reduced charges for shore bombardments and things like that, but yeah, full charges on the Mark 8s obviously still occupying the same volume. As far as I'm aware of, it should be fired with the full charges. Oh, and yeah, obviously, if I do go on foreign adventures, I will be telling people in advance so that they can come and say hi if they wish to. Right, so one last question. Let's take one from someone who... Vicky McDonough, I think. Yes, says for future question asking the middle syllable of my last name is pronounced done, not rhyming with on. Okay, well, I apologise. I used the other pronunciation because there was a chap in my high school class who had ostensibly the same name, and I pronounced it the way that his was, so different pronunciations, I guess. Right. So, one last question. Come on, get one. Let's grab one. There's a lot of question about Taco Bell and Burger King, but that doesn't seem like the right question to finish on. Do, 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 do. So many people. I'm trying to find someone who hasn't asked a question, who hasn't had a question answered yet in the last 40 questions. That one I've answered. There's one. Redstone Builder. I don't think I've answered any of his questions yet. Before I go into aluminium fence, what's wrong with Croydon? What isn't wrong with Croydon? I mean, I worked there for 4 years. Croydon. There's some things to like about Croydon. There's an awful lot not to like about Croydon. But put it this way, one of my earliest experiences of Croydon was accidentally going to the town centre cinema instead of the out-of-town centre cinema, and having to step my way across at least 4 people who were either unconscious or been beaten up and or been stabbed, and around one guy who was who had been hit hard enough that there was blood pooling around his head. He had, to be fair, police and ambulance in attendance, and that was on a quarter-mile walk from the cinema to my car. And that's not typical for most British towns at 11 o'clock at night. And yeah, when I worked there, let's just put it this way. The first time someone got chased out of East Croydon Railway Station, chased down into the high street and stabbed in broad daylight, I was shocked and horrified. The third or fourth time it happened, I was just like, oh, I guess that roadblock's going to mean I'm late for getting home again. Yeah. Oh well. Anyway, Redstone Builder asked if any of the later refit standards, like the Tennessees, West Virginia, etc., were able to take part in the war a year earlier, what Atlantic events could they have been taking part in? I mean, it depends on exactly which one, but the later refits are only really available right towards the end of the war, in broad overall terms. So, and by sort of 43, early 44, there's not a huge amount of Atlantic events left. They basically, given their speed, they'd probably either be shore bombardment for Husky and Avalanche in Sicily and Italy, or they'd be shore bombardments at D-Day, because the only sort of major Atlantic fight, if you like, or that side of the world naval battle involving battleships in 43, 44 is Battle of North Cape against Scharnhorst, and for that you need fast capital ships, which even in their refitted conditions the standards aren't. So yeah, unfortunately it would basically be shore bombardment. They'd have to be in service by kind of late 42 for any kind of major throwdowns with other navies' big capital ships. Yeah, oh yes, of course, aluminium fence. How could I forget the Croydon riots when a bunch of stuff was really on fire? So, okay, Robert Denduven, if I missed your question, then I apologise. Your opinion of the usefulness of the new fast US battleships working with the Royal Navy's Home Fleet in 42 versus going to the Pacific in the first half of 42. I'm thinking of BB 55 and 56 at Midway. I mean, you could argue that having the anti-aircraft fire support of the two battleships might have saved Yorktown at Midway. Equally, they might have ended up being hit. and at least sent back for repairs. I think overall, harsh as it might sound for poor old Yorktown, the US fast battleships were probably a lot better off for the Allies in the home fleet in 42 than at Midway, because ultimately, whilst there was a bit of a period at the end of 42, beginning of 43, where the US carrier fleet was generally a little bit on the ropes, even at the time of Midway, there were enough Essexes building that as a long-term strategy, it was fairly clear that the US Navy was not going to be short of carriers after a year or so at that point. Whereas in early 42, they needed to get the Arctic convoys through. They were facing, in 42, the potential threat of multiple German fast capital ships, and the Royal Navy just flat out didn't have enough on hand. As I think I explained in... I can't remember which video it was, but I think I explained in one of the videos where I was talking about events in early 43, it's sometimes not appreciated just what a bad state the Royal Navy's fast capital ship fleet was in at that point, because you had Prince of Wales had just gone down to Singapore and gotten itself sunk along with Repulse. Hood obviously had been destroyed, so that meant out of the battle cruisers you had Renown, so you had one, and Brunel could take on Scharnhorst fine, but no one was really going to rate it against Tirpitz. And then with the loss of Prince of Wales, apart from Renown, you had King George V. And by early 43, Duke of York was on its way towards being complete, but Duke of York was not in a position really to viably go out as a Arctic convoy escort. And even if it was, if you wanted to trust a brand new ship at some point in early 43 without duty, if the Royal Navy's only got 2 or maybe 3 fast capital ships and the Germans have 2, then the Royal Navy's going to have its entire fast capital ship strength in the home fleet, and nothing available in Italy. So you've got Anson and Howe coming along, sure, and Duke of York eventually, once it works itself up to become a fully reliable fast combatant, but all of that's in the future. So having a US fast battleship or 2 really evens everything out. It gives the Arctic convoys and the North Sea in general not only an ability to match the Germans, but actually an ability to have an overmatch for the Germans at any given time, because it means the Royal Navy can consistently have 2 fast battleships available in the heavy covering force, with more in reserve if necessary. And that means that even on the best of days, the Germans can come out with 2 of their own, and with the best will in the world, Scharnhorst is not a match for a South Dakota or a North Carolina or a King George V, which means that even though hull number wise the Germans can match, they can't actually match superior in terms of overall firepower wise. So, okay, the Germans never did sortie, but perhaps a good chunk of the reason why they didn't is because they knew what the opposition would be. So, from an overall Allied perspective, the presence of the US fast battleships in that area was absolutely key. And now it's time for me to eat my food after the final super chat that sneaked in right at the very end. Ian Brannan asking, did the Halifax explosion in 1917 have a significant effect on how military explosives were transported navally elsewhere in the world? Yes and no. In that, yes, it had an effect. No, it didn't have an effect on how how military explosives were supposed to be transported. It did have an effect in terms of people turning around and going, maybe having a bunch of highly flammable liquid explosives on deck in an already overstocked ship is not such a good idea. So yeah, it basically encouraged people to maybe pay a bit more care and attention to what the guidelines said they should be doing, rather than trying to cram as much explosive as humanly possible into a ship, which turned out to be a very big mistake. So with that said, at 23:42, I'm going to bid everyone adieu and try and salvage something from all this cold food. Thanks very much for being here, everyone, listening, etc., etc., and see you again in another video. Bye.